Baron Vladimir Harkonnen died at the hands of a child. The most powerful, most cunning, most politically sophisticated head of one of the Imperium's wealthiest noble houses was killed by a girl who was barely more than 2 years old, killed by Alia Atreides, the preborn daughter of Paul Muad'Dib, who drove a Gom Jabbar into the Baron's flesh during the battle for Arrakis and ended the life of the man whose schemes had shaped the Imperium's political landscape for decades. The death was not a military event. The death was a personal event, was the encounter between the person and the consequence, between the schemer and the scheme's product, between the man who had destroyed House Atreides and the child whose existence the destruction had ultimately produced. The Baron had orchestrated the assault on the Atreides household. The assault had driven Jessica and Paul into the desert. The desert had produced Alia. Alia killed the Baron. The chain of causation ran from the Baron's schemes, through the assault, through the desert, through the child, back to the Baron's own body. The Baron was killed by his own consequences. This was the pattern that House Harkonnen's complete history demonstrated across 10,000 years of institutional operation, the pattern of the schemes that produced the consequences that consumed the schemers, the exploitation that generated the resistance that destroyed the exploiters, the instruments that turned on the hands that wielded them. This is the story of House Harkonnen, not simply the story of the Baron, though the Baron was the house's most fully documented head, the story of the house, the 10,000-year institutional history of the dynasty whose character was shaped by the world the dynasty governed, whose methods were defined by the tradition the dynasty maintained, and whose destruction was produced by the consequences the dynasty's own operations generated. House Harkonnen's origins were the origins of a noble house within the Imperium's feudal framework, a family whose position in the Landsraad's hierarchy was established through the political dynamics the post-Jihad settlement had produced. The house's early history was connected to the Battle of Corrin, the decisive military engagement that ended the Butlerian Jihad and established the political conditions for the Imperium's founding. The Harkonnen name's association with the Battle of Corrin was an association whose character the house's institutional memory maintained across the millennia of the house's subsequent history, an association that connected the house's origins to the civilizational event the battle constituted. The association included the dimension that connected the Harkonnen name to the Atreides name, the dimension that established the feud whose persistence across the millennia would shape both houses' institutional histories. The feud's origins at the Battle of Corrin were the origins that the house's competing institutional memories maintained in the versions the memory's respective traditions sustained, each house's account of the events attributing the responsibility and the dishonor the feud's persistence required. The feud was ancient. The animosity between House Harkonnen and House Atreides was maintained across the 10,000 years the Imperium's political history encompassed, was sustained through the generations, the centuries, the millennia of the house's parallel institutional development. The maintenance was institutional rather than personal, was conducted through the house's traditions rather than through the individual's experiences, was transmitted through the cultural memories rather than through the personal encounters. The institutional maintenance was the feud's most consequential quality. The personal animosity would have faded, would have diminished across the generations the personal memory could not sustain, would have been reduced by the time the personal experience could not bridge. The institutional maintenance prevented the fading, sustained the animosity through the cultural transmission the institutional tradition provided, maintained the hatred through the mechanisms the institutional memory employed. The maintenance was deliberate. Both houses maintained the feud, both houses transmitted the animosity, Both houses sustained the hatred through the institutional mechanisms the cultural tradition provided. The maintenance served both houses' institutional purposes, provided the institutional identity the hatred sustained, maintained the enemy whose presence the institutional cohesion required, sustained the rivalry whose persistence the institutional culture's definition depended on. The Harkonnens needed the Atreides. The need was institutional, was the requirement for the enemy whose existence defined the house's identity in the opposition the rivalry constituted. The Harkonnens defined themselves against the Atreides, identified the house's character through the contrast with the Atreides' character, maintained the house's institutional identity through the distinction from the Atreides tradition the contrast provided. The Atreides were the light. The Harkonnens were the shadow. The metaphor was the Imperium's political culture's description of the house's contrast. The characterization that the political landscape's observers produced from the house's institutional characters comparison. The characterization was not neutral, was informed by the assessment that the Atreides' governance as service tradition was preferable to the Harkonnens' governance as exploitation tradition. The assessment was the Landsraad's assessment, was the political landscape's evaluation of the two houses' traditions' respective merits. The Harkonnens rejected the assessment. The house's institutional culture maintained the position that the Harkonnen tradition was effective, that the exploitation the tradition employed was the method that produced the results the governance required, that the instrumentalism the tradition practiced was the approach that generated the outcomes the institutional purposes demanded. The rejection was sincere. The Harkonnens did not practice the exploitation while believing the exploitation was wrong. The Harkonnens practiced the exploitation while believing the exploitation was right, while maintaining the institutional conviction that the instrumental treatment of resources, populations, and persons was the governance's appropriate method, that the exploitation's productivity was the exploitation's justification, that the outcomes the exploitation generated were the outcomes that demonstrated the exploitation's validity. The conviction was the house's institutional philosophy. The philosophy was not articulated in the philosophical form the academic tradition would have recognized, was not stated as the systematic argument the philosophical discourse required. The philosophy was practiced, was embodied in the governance's methods, was expressed through the institutional operations character, was demonstrated through the house's treatment of the resources and the populations the governance managed. Giedi Prime was the world that shaped the Harkonnen philosophy, the planet whose conditions produced the institutional character the house's tradition maintained. Giedi Prime was industrial. The planet's economy was organized around the manufacturing and the extraction that made the planet one of the Imperium's most productive economic units. The production was the planet's purpose, was the activity the governance organized the population around, the function the planet's institutional operations served. The production consumed. The industrial economy's operations consumed the planet's resources, extracted the materials the manufacturing required, processed the inputs the production demanded, generated the outputs the commerce distributed. The consumption was comprehensive, encompassed the environmental resources the extraction depleted, the human resources the labor consumed. The ecological conditions the production's byproducts degraded. The consumption's comprehensiveness was the governance philosophy's environmental expression. The planet bore the philosophy's marks, showed the exploitation's consequences in the environmental conditions the industrial operations produced. The pollution, the degradation, the ecological deterioration that the production's operations generated, all were the philosophy's visible evidence. the environmental demonstration of what the governance's instrumental approach produced when the approach was applied to the world the governance managed. The population was managed as the production's labour force. The people of Giedi Prime were governed as the workers the economy required, were administered through the institutional mechanisms the production's demands generated, were managed through the governance's apparatus the labour's organisation demanded. The management was instrumental, treated the population as the resource the production consumed, administered the persons as the inputs the economy processed. The instrumental management was the governance philosophy's social expression. The population experienced the philosophy as the conditions the management imposed, experienced the exploitation as the working conditions, the living conditions. The social conditions the governance's instrumental approach produced. The experience was not comfortable. The experience was the exploitation's social product, was the consequence the instrumental treatment generated in the persons the treatment was applied to. The gladiatorial arenas were the governance philosophy's recreational expression. The arenas provided the entertainment, the population's leisure, the governance's social management included, provided the spectacle, the population's emotional needs, the governance's social calculus addressed. The spectacle was violent, was the managed combat the arena's programming presented, the fighting to the death the entertainment's content consisted of. The violence was deliberate. The arena's programming was designed to provide the cathartic violence the population's political exclusion required, was calibrated to deliver the emotional release the governance's denial of the political participation the population might otherwise have demanded generated. The arenas were the substitute, were the mechanism the governance provided in place of the political engagement the governance denied. The population could not participate in governance. The population could watch people die. The watching was the governance's provision for the participation's absence. The Harkonnen lineage's relationship with the Bene Gesserit was the relationship that connected the house's political history to the breeding program's genetic management, the relationship through which the sisterhood's institutional interests intersected with the house's institutional operations. The Bene Gesserit managed the Harkonnen bloodline, the sisterhood's breeding program, the 90-generation genetic management plan whose objective was the Kwisatz Haderach's production, included the Harkonnen genetics in the program's managed configurations. The Harkonnen bloodline carried the genetic components the program required, carried the genetic material the program's design specified for the configurations the Kwisatz Haderach's eventual production demanded. The management was covert. The Harkonnens did not know the sisterhood was managing the bloodline, did not perceive the breeding program's involvement in the house's reproductive decisions, did not recognize the institutional manipulation the sisterhood's management constituted. The management was conducted through the mechanisms the sisterhood's covert operations provided, through the placements, the recommendations. The institutional influence the sisterhood's political network deployed for the breeding program's purposes. The covert management was the sisterhood's institutional character applied to the Harkonnen bloodline, the same methodology the sisterhood applied to every bloodline the program managed, conducted with the same institutional discretion the program's covert operation required. The Harkonnens were not singled out. The Harkonnens were managed, were included in the program's management alongside the other bloodlines the program encompassed. The management's most consequential product was Jessica, the woman the sisterhood placed with Duke Leto Atreides, the Bene Gesserit, whose training equipped her for the placement's institutional purposes, was the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen's daughter. The relationship was biological, was the genetic connection the breeding program's management had produced through the configurations the program's design specified. Jessica was a Harkonnen. The fact, undisclosed during the saga's early events, revealed through the narrative's development, was the fact that connected the Atreides household to the Harkonnen bloodline through the genetic link the breeding program's management had created. Jessica carried the Baron's genetics. Paul carried the Baron's genetics through Jessica. The Kwisatz Haderach, the Atreides Messiah, the Fremen's Lisan al-Gaib, was the Baron's grandchild. The genetic connection was the feud's deepest irony. The houses that had maintained the animosity for 10,000 years were connected by the blood the breeding program's management had combined, were linked through the genetics the sisterhood's institutional operation had intertwined. The feud's opposing sides were genetically joined. The hatred's objects were biologically related. The irony was the breeding program's unintended commentary on the feud the program's management had intersected with. The Baron did not know Jessica was his daughter. The non-knowledge was the breeding program's covert operations product. Was the consequence of the secrecy the program's institutional management maintained, was the result of the discretion the sisterhood's operations applied to the configurations the program produced. The non-knowledge meant the Baron did not know Paul was his grandson. The political enemy the Baron's schemes were designed to destroy. The Atreides heir, whose elimination the Baron's conspiracy was organized around, was the Baron's biological grandchild. The destruction was directed at the family. The irony was the non-knowledge's product was generated by the disconnect between the biological relationship the genetics constituted and the political relationship the feud maintained. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was the house's most fully documented head, the person whose governance of the Harkonnen institutional operations was recorded with the detail the saga's narrative provided, and whose character was rendered with the sustained attention the character's significance required. The Baron's body was the first thing the encounter registered. The physical form, the massive, obese body, whose weight exceeded what the musculoskeletal system could support without the technological assistance the suspensors provided, was the physical presentation that dominated the perception of the person the body contained. The obesity was not natural. The Baron had not always been obese, had not been born into the body the governance period's observers encountered. The Baron had been lean in the younger years, had maintained the physical form the Harkonnen tradition's martial training produced. The obesity was the consequence, was the product of the condition the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam had inflicted on the Baron through the disease the sexual encounter had transmitted. The disease was Mohiam's weapon. The Reverend Mother, whose interaction with the Baron had been conducted for the breeding program's purposes, had given the Baron the disease whose progression produced the obesity the Baron's later years were defined by. The disease was deliberate, was the Bene Gesserit's instrument deployed against the person the instrument was designed to affect, was the biological weapon applied to the body the weapon was intended to modify. The modification was progressive. The disease's effects developed across the years of the Baron's maturation, progressed from the initial infection through the sustained deterioration that produced the obesity the later years encompassed. The progression was the weapon's operation, the biological mechanism's sustained modification of the body's physiology across the timeline the weapon's design specified. The suspensors were the management. The anti-gravity devices that the Baron's clothing incorporated, the technology that reduced the body's effective weight to the levels the movement the governance required, were the technological response to the biological condition the disease had produced. The suspensors allowed the Baron to move, allowed the body to function despite the weight the musculoskeletal system could not support, allowed the person to operate despite the physical condition the disease had imposed. The body was the humiliation. The Baron, whose vanity the younger year's physical form had sustained, whose self-presentation the lean body's appearance had supported, experienced the obesity as the humiliation the disease's progression had imposed. The experience was the weapon's intended effect. Was the consequence the Bene Gesserit's deployment of the biological weapon was designed to produce alongside the physical effects the disease generated? The humiliation did not reduce the Baron's capabilities. The mind, the political intelligence, the strategic assessment, the institutional management's capability the Baron's governance demonstrated was not impaired by the body's condition. The mind operated despite the body. The mind's operation was the Baron's most consequential quality, the quality that made the Baron, the political actor, the Imperium's landscape, recognized despite the body's condition the disease had produced. The Baron's mind was the mind the governance tradition had produced, the intelligence whose capabilities reflected the institutional culture the Harkonnen tradition maintained, and whose operations expressed the governance philosophy the tradition embodied. The mind was tactical. The Baron's intelligence operated in the political landscape's competitive dimension, assessed the landscape's actors, evaluated the actors' positions, calculated the interventions the Baron's institutional interests required. The assessment was sustained, was the ongoing operation the governance's management demanded, was the continuous evaluation the political landscape's dynamics required. The mind was also manipulative. The Baron's intelligence included the capacity for the person's management, the ability to assess the person's vulnerabilities, to identify the leverage the vulnerabilities provided, to deploy the leverage for the outcomes the manipulation was designed to produce. The capacity was the governance tradition's product, was the skill the institutional culture had cultivated through the generations of the governance's competitive practice. The manipulation was the governance's primary instrument. The Baron governed through manipulation, through the management of persons, through the person's vulnerabilities, through the deployment of leverage for the outcomes the leverage could produce, through the sustained exercise of the interpersonal influence the manipulation skills made available. The instrument was effective. The Baron's manipulation produced the outcomes the manipulation was designed to generate, managed the persons the governance encompassed, controlled the institutional operations the governance administered, maintained the political position the governance's competitive success required. The effectiveness was the instrument's validation, the demonstration that the manipulation's deployment produced the results the deployment was intended to generate. The instrument was also characteristic. The Baron's reliance on manipulation, the governance's organization around the manipulation's deployment rather than around the authority's exercise or the service's provision, was the governance tradition's expression in the Baron's personal style. The tradition said, govern through exploitation. The Baron's manipulation was the exploitation applied to the persons, was the governance tradition's instrumentalism deployed in the interpersonal dimension. The Baron's management of his heirs was the management that demonstrated the governance philosophy's application to the family, the treatment of the nephews as the instruments the governance's succession planning required. The Baron had two nephews, Glossu Raban and Fade Rautha Harkonnen. The nephews were the Baron's heirs, the persons whose succession to the house's leadership the governance's planning was organized around. Raban was the older nephew. Raban's character, the brutal, unsubtle, physically imposing person the house's martial tradition had produced, was the character the Baron assessed as useful but limited. The assessment was the governance philosophy's application to the person. The evaluation of the nephew as the instrument whose capabilities the governance could deploy for the purposes the capabilities were suited to. The Baron deployed Raban as the oppressor. The two-phase plan for Arrakis, the Baron's strategic design for the recovery of the Arrakis fief after the Atreides' destruction, included Raban as the first phase's instrument. The first phase was the oppression, the governance of Arrakis through the brutality the suppressed population would experience as the intolerable conditions the oppression constituted. The oppression was deliberate. The Baron did not deploy Raban despite Raban's brutality. The Baron deployed Raban because of Raban's brutality, selected the nephew whose character would produce the oppressive governance the plan's first phase required, chose the instrument whose qualities matched the function the deployment was designed to serve. Raban governed Arrakis with the brutality the deployment specified. The governance was harsh, exceeded what the production's management required, imposed the conditions the population experienced as the suffering the governance generated. The harshness was the plan's content, was the political condition the first phase was designed to produce for the second phase's exploitation. The second phase was Feyd-Rautha, the younger nephew whose character the Baron was cultivating for the more sophisticated governance the second phase required, was the instrument the plan's second phase would deploy. The design was this: Raban would oppress. The population would suffer. Feyd-Rautha would replace Raban. The population would experience Feyd-Rautha's governance as the relief the oppression's cessation constituted. The relief would produce the gratitude. The gratitude would produce the loyalty. The loyalty would secure the Harkonnen governance through the population's acceptance rather than through the governance's force. The design was sophisticated. The plan's logic, the use of the oppression to produce the conditions the relief would exploit, the deployment of the suffering to generate the gratitude the succession would harvest, was the governance philosophy's strategic expression. The philosophy treated the population as the instrument, as the resource the governance's strategic planning could manipulate through the conditions the planning specified. The plan's sophistication was the Baron's intelligence's most sustained demonstration, the demonstration that the mind's political capability could design the multi-phase strategies whose logic exceeded what the single-phase approach could produce. The design was the intelligence's product. The product was the governance philosophy's expression. The expression was the tradition's operation in the person the tradition had produced. Feyd-Rautha was the Baron's cultivated heir. The younger nephew, the person the Baron was developing for the house's future leadership, was the person whose capabilities the Baron's management was designed to produce. The management included the gladiatorial training, the arena combat that developed the physical capability and the public persona the second phase's governance would require. The management included the political education, the instruction in the governance's strategic dimensions that the leadership's operation would demand. The gladiatorial combat was managed. Feyd-Rautha's arena fights, the public demonstrations of the heir's combat capability the house's political presentation included, were managed for the outcomes the presentation required. The opponents were selected. Some opponents were compromised, were given drugs or other handicaps that ensured the outcomes the presentation specified. The management was the governance philosophy's application to the combat, the treatment of the fights as the instruments the political presentation required, rather than as the tests the combat's character demanded. The management's exposure, the potential revelation that the fights were managed rather than authentic, was the management's most consequential risk. The managed fight's discovery would have exposed the heir's presentation as the manufactured performance the management constituted, would have demonstrated that the combat capability the presentation claimed was the managed outcome rather than the demonstrated skill. This was the governance philosophy's vulnerability. The philosophy that treated everything as the instrument, that managed the combat, the governance, the persons through the manipulation the instrumentalism employed, was the philosophy whose operations were vulnerable to the exposure the instrumentalism's concealment required. The concealment was necessary because the instrumentalism's effectiveness depended on the concealment's maintenance. The exposure would have eliminated the effectiveness the concealment sustained. The Baron's conspiracy with Shaddam IV was the conspiracy that connected the Harkonnen institutional interests to the Corrino dynasty's political calculations. The conspiracy whose operation produced the Atreides household's destruction and whose consequences generated the revolution that destroyed both conspirators. The conspiracy was motivated by convergent interests. The Baron's interest was the Arrakis fief's recovery, the return of the Spice governance's economic and political benefits to the Harkonnen house's control. Shaddam's interest was the Atreides' elimination, the removal of the house whose political qualities threatened the dynasty's governance. The convergence was the conspiracy's foundation. The two interests aligned, both required the Atreides' destruction, both were served by the same operational outcome, both benefited from the same event's occurrence. The alignment made the conspiracy natural, made the cooperation between the parties whose interests converged the rational institutional response the convergence's logic suggested. The conspiracy's design was the Baron's. The operational planning, the strategic design for the Atreides' destruction on Arrakis, was the Baron's contribution to the conspiracy. The design was the intelligence's product, was the strategic assessment the Baron's political capability had generated for the operation the convergent interests required. The Emperor's contribution was the Sardaukar, the imperial military force, the soldiers whose capability exceeded the conventional military forces the Imperium's noble houses maintained, was the Emperor's contribution to the operation. The Sardaukar were deployed in Harkonnen uniforms, were disguised as the Harkonnen troops the operation's cover required. The disguise was the conspiracy's deniability, the mechanism through which the Emperor's participation was concealed from the political observation the Landsraad's monitoring constituted. The operation was executed. The Atreides household was destroyed. The Duke was killed. The military force was eliminated. The governance apparatus was dismantled. The destruction was comprehensive, encompassed the household's institutional dimensions alongside the household's personal dimensions, eliminated the governance alongside the governors. The destruction's comprehensiveness was the Baron's intention. The Baron did not intend the partial destruction, did not design the operation for the Atreides' weakening rather than the Atreides' elimination. The Baron designed the operation for the elimination, for the complete destruction of the household the operation was directed against, for the comprehensive removal of the institutional presence the Atreides represented on Arrakis. The comprehensiveness was the operation's achievement and the operation's failure. The achievement was the destruction, the elimination of the Atreides household's institutional form, the removal of the governance apparatus the household had maintained. The failure was the incompleteness, the survival of Jessica and Paul, the escape into the desert that the comprehensiveness's ambition had not managed to prevent. The Baron was present on Arrakis during the assault. The house's head was on the planet as the operation unfolded, was positioned to manage the operation's execution and to assume the governance the operation's success would provide. The presence was the governance's operational expression, the demonstration that the Baron managed the house's most consequential operation from the proximity the management's immediacy required. The survival of Jessica and Paul was the comprehensiveness's failure, the gap in the destruction's coverage that the operation's execution had not closed. The gap was consequential, was the opening through which the consequences the destruction was supposed to prevent would enter the political landscape. Jessica and Paul survived. The survival produced the Desert Period. The Desert Period produced the Revolution. The Revolution destroyed the Baron. The gap was the operation's most consequential element. The destruction that was designed to be comprehensive, that was intended to eliminate the Atreides' presence completely, was the destruction that missed the two persons whose survival would produce the consequences the destruction was designed to prevent. The comprehensiveness was almost complete. The almost was everything. The Baron's governance of Arrakis, both through the 80 years preceding the Atreides transfer and through the period following the Atreides destruction, was the governance that demonstrated the House's institutional philosophy applied to the Imperium's most consequential economic asset. The governance was exploitative. The spice production, the harvesting operations that collected the melange from the desert's deposits, was managed through the instrumentalist approach the Harkonnen tradition maintained. The planet was the resource. The population was the labor. The production was the output. The governance's purpose was the output's maximization. The maximization consumed. The governance's pursuit of the production's maximum output consumed the resources the maximization required, consumed the equipment the operations deployed, consumed the personnel the operations employed, consumed the environmental conditions the production's operations affected. The consumption was the governance philosophy's operational expression, the demonstration of what the instrumentalist approach produced when the approach was applied to the world the governance managed. The governance did not understand the ecology. The Harkonnen tradition's instrumentalist approach focused on the production's output rather than on the production's ecological foundations, focused on the spices collection rather than on the sandworm life cycle's biology, focused on the commodity's commercial value rather than on the ecological system the commodity was produced by. The non-understanding was the governance philosophy's intellectual limitation. The philosophy that treated the world as the resource treated the world's ecology as the resource's context rather than as the resource's source. The treatment produced the ignorance, the absence of the ecological awareness the production's sustainability required, the lack of the biological understanding the production's foundations demanded. The ignorance was characteristic. The Harkonnen governance tradition did not include the ecological dimension, did not encompass the awareness of the environmental systems the governance was operating within, did not extend to the comprehension of the biological processes the governance's economic activities depended on. The tradition governed the production. The tradition did not understand the production. The Fremen were managed as the population's inconvenient component. The desert people, the civilization the governance's instrumentalist approach assessed as the population's least productive element, were managed through the governance's suppressive methods. The suppression was sustained, was maintained across the decades of the Harkonnen governance's operation, was conducted through the military and the administrative mechanisms the governance's apparatus provided. The suppression was also ignorant. The governance did not understand the Fremen, did not assess the desert civilization's capabilities, did not evaluate the Fremen's military potential, did not recognize the population's significance beyond the governance's instrumentalist assessment of the population's economic contribution. The ignorance was comprehensive. The governance did not know how many Fremen there were. The governance did not know where the Fremen lived. The governance did not know what the Fremen were capable of. The governance did not know the Fremen's relationship with the sandworm ecology. The governance did not know the Fremen's military training's character. The governance knew nothing about the Fremen that the governance's instrumentalist assessment had not produced. The nothing was the governance's vulnerability. The governance that did not understand the population was the governance that could not assess the population's threat. The governance that could not assess the threat was the governance that could not prepare for the threat's deployment. The governance was vulnerable to the Fremen because the governance did not understand the Fremen. The non-understanding was the governance philosophy's most consequential product, the intellectual blindness, the instrumentalism generated through the instrumentalism's focus on the production rather than on the population. The Baron's destruction was the destruction the Baron's own operations had produced, the consequence that the Baron's schemes had generated through the chain of causation the scheme's execution had initiated. The revolution was the consequence. Paul's emergence from the desert at the head of the Fremen army whose capabilities the Baron's governance had failed to assess was the consequence the survival's gap had produced through the desert period's development. The revolution was the military expression of the consequences the Baron's operations had generated, the deployment of the force the governance's ignorance had concealed against the governance the force was directed toward. The revolution was overwhelming. The Fremen's military capability, developed through millennia of the desert's environmental hardening, enhanced through the spice's cognitive effects, motivated through the messianic identification's religious fervor, exceeded the Harkonnen Sardaukar defensive forces' capability by the margin the environmental hardening's difference produced. The defenders were defeated. The governance was overthrown. The Baron's political position was eliminated. The Baron's death was personal rather than military. Elia, the preborn child whose consciousness encompassed the other memories' ancestral presences, killed the Baron during the battle's political confrontation. The killing was conducted with the Gum Jabbar, the poison needle the Bene Gesserit tradition maintained for the humanity test the needle's deployment could administer. The needle penetrated the Baron's flesh. The poison acted. The Baron died. The death's personal character was the death's most consequential quality. The Baron was not killed by the military force the revolution deployed. The Baron was killed by the child the revolution had produced, by the person whose existence was the consequence of the chain the Baron's own operations had initiated. The Baron destroyed the Atreides. The destruction drove Jessica and Paul into the desert. The desert produced Elia. Elia killed the Baron. The chain was complete. The consequences returned to the source. The return was the governance philosophy's ultimate demonstration. The philosophy that treated persons as instruments, that deployed the persons for the outcomes the deployment was designed to produce, was the philosophy whose consequences produced the person who destroyed the philosophy's practitioner. The Baron used persons. The consequences produced the person who destroyed the Baron. The using produced the destroyer. The instrument turned on the hand. Feyd-Rauther's death was the House's succession's elimination, the destruction of the heir the Baron had cultivated for the House's future leadership, alongside the destruction of the head the heir was being cultivated to succeed. Feyd-Rauther fought Paul. The combat, conducted in the formal challenge the political confrontation's resolution required, was the single combat between the Harkonnen heir and the Atreides claimant. The combat was the feud's personal expression, the encounter between the house's representatives in the physical dimension the combat constituted. Feyd-Rauther was skilled. The gladiatorial training the Baron's cultivation had provided, the arena combat the heir's development had included, had produced the physical capability the combat demands required. The skill was real. was the combat capability the training had developed despite the managed fights the political presentation had produced. Feyd-Rautha also cheated. The combat included the concealed weapon. The poisoned blade, the concealment the combat's rules prohibited, had nevertheless introduced into the engagement. The concealment was characteristic, was the governance philosophy's application to the combat's personal dimension, the instrumentalism's deployment in the fight, the instrumentalism's concealment was designed to win. Paul detected the concealment. The prescient awareness, the consciousness whose perception encompassed the probability space's content, detected the poisoned blade's presence despite the concealment the blade's introduction had employed. The detection was the prescient capability's application to the combat's dimension. The awareness of the concealed threat the prescient perception's comprehensiveness encompassed. Paul killed Feyd-Rautha. The combat's conclusion was the Atreides' victory, the elimination of the Harkonnen heir through the combat the challenge had produced. The killing was the succession's termination, the destruction of the person the House's future leadership was being developed in alongside the destruction of the person the House's current leadership was conducted by. The dual destruction, the Baron's death and Feyd-Rautha's death, was the House's political elimination. The head and the heir were killed in the same engagement. The House's leadership was eliminated in the single afternoon the battle for Arrakis encompassed. The 10,000-year House was decapitated in the Revolution's single day. Rabban was also killed. The older nephew, the instrument the Baron had deployed for the first phase's oppressive governance, was eliminated alongside the head and the younger heir. The elimination was comprehensive, encompassed the House's entire political leadership in the single event the revolution constituted. The comprehensiveness was the revolution's most consequential Harkonnen dimension, the destruction that eliminated the House's leadership in its entirety, that removed the governance tradition's practitioners in a single engagement, that ended the 10,000-year lineage's political operation in the afternoon the battle required. The Harkonnen House's destruction was not the Harkonnen genetics' destruction. The genetics survived, carried in the persons the breeding program's management had placed in the Atreides household's biological lineage. Jessica was the Baron's daughter. The genetic connection established through the breeding program's management of the Harkonnen bloodline was the connection that carried the Harkonnen genetics into the Atreides household through Jessica's placement with Duke Leto. The connection survived the house's political destruction, persisted in the persons the connection's biology sustained, regardless of the political conditions the house's destruction imposed. Paul was the Baron's grandson, the Kwisatz Haderach, the Atreides emperor, whose revolution had destroyed the Harkonnen house, carried the Harkonnen genetics the breeding program's management had contributed to the Atreides bloodline. The emperor who destroyed the house was the grandson of the house's head. The destroyer carried the destroyed's genetics. The irony was the breeding program's unintended product, the genetic connection between the destroyer and the destroyed that the program's covert management had created. The twins, Leto and Ganima, were the Baron's great-grandchildren, the children whose pre-born consciousness carried the ancestral presences the genetics encompassed, were the children whose genetics included the Harkonnen contribution the breeding program's management had introduced into the Atreides bloodline 2 generations earlier. The genetic persistence was the House's biological legacy, the House's political legacy, the governance tradition, the institutional philosophy, the competitive position the Landsraad's hierarchy had included, was destroyed. The House's biological legacy, the genetics the breeding program's management had contributed to the Atreides bloodline, persisted. The persistence was the genetics character, a quality that made the biological contribution more durable than the political operation the contribution's source had maintained. The durability was the breeding program's product. The sisterhood's management of the bloodlines, the sustained, generational, institutionally managed genetic configurations the program produced, was the management that created the biological connections the political events could not sever. The connections persisted because the connections were biological rather than political, were carried in the organism's genetics rather than in the institution's operations, were maintained by the biology's transmission rather than by the politics' maintenance. The Baron's presence in Elia's other memory was the presence that connected the destroyed house's head to the surviving Atreides line's most vulnerable consciousness, the presence that made the dead Baron the most consequential antagonist in the Children of Dune period's political narrative. Elia was pre-born. The consciousness that had been activated in the womb during Jessica's spice agony, the awareness that had been exposed to the other memory's ancestral presences before the developmental protections the ordinary birth provided, was the consciousness the pre-born condition had produced. The condition made Elia vulnerable, made the consciousness susceptible to the ancestral presence's displacement of the individual self the consciousness's development should have produced. The Baron was among the presences. The ancestral personality preserved in the genetic memory the preborn consciousness accessed was present in Elia's other memory alongside the other ancestral presences the genetics encompassed. The Baron was there, was the personality whose political intelligence and whose manipulative capability the living Baron had demonstrated. Preserved in the biological medium the genetic memory constituted, the Baron waited. The patience, characteristic of the living Baron's strategic planning, maintained in the ancestral personality's preserved form, was the patience the presence exercised in the other memory's populated landscape. The Baron waited for the opportunity. The opportunity was the displacement, the moment at which the ancestral personality's assertive presence could overwhelm the individual self the preborn condition's vulnerability made susceptible. The displacement occurred. The Baron's personality asserted itself, took control of Elia's consciousness through the displacement the preborn condition's vulnerability permitted. The assertion was the dead Baron's most consequential political achievement, the posthumous seizure of the consciousness that inhabited the Regency's political position, the dead schemer's occupation of the living person's awareness. The abomination was the displacement's institutional expression, the Bene Gesserit term, the label the Sisterhood's institutional knowledge assigned to the preborn condition's realized risk, was the term that described Elia's condition after the Baron's displacement had converted the individual consciousness into the ancestral personality's inhabited vessel. The Baron governed through Elia. The dead man's political intelligence, the strategic capability the living Baron had demonstrated across decades of the House's governance, was deployed through Elia's consciousness for the governance the Regency's political position encompassed. The governance was the instrumentalist approach's expression through the displaced consciousness's operations, was the manipulation tradition's deployment through the person the displacement had provided. The governance deteriorated. The Regency's political operations, conducted under the Baron's influence through the displaced consciousness's management, produced the deterioration the instrumentalist approach generated when the approach was applied to the governance the Regency encompassed. The deterioration was the governance philosophy's consequence, was the product the exploitation generated in the institutional landscape the exploitation was deployed in. The deterioration demonstrated the governance philosophy's limitation. the philosophy that treated persons and institutions as instruments that managed the governance through the manipulation the instrumentalism employed, was the philosophy whose deployment through the regency produced the deterioration the deployment generated. The philosophy worked for the house's competitive purposes. The philosophy did not work for the regency's governing purposes. The competitive and the governing were different functions. The philosophy's effectiveness in the competitive dimension did not translate to the governing dimension. Alia's end was the Baron's end, the second death of the personality whose first death the Gorm Jabbar had produced. Alia's death terminated the consciousness the Baron's presence had displaced, ended the awareness the ancestral personality had occupied, eliminated the vessel the displacement had provided. The Baron died again, died in the consciousness the Baron's displacement had inhabited, died in the person the Baron's assertive presence had overwhelmed. The second death was the governance philosophy's final consequence in the personal dimension. The philosophy whose practitioner had been killed by the consequences the philosophy's operations had produced was the philosophy whose posthumous practitioner was killed by the consequences the philosophy's posthumous operations generated. The consequences consumed the practitioner. The consumption occurred twice. The pattern held. The Harkonnen legacy's presence in Leto II was the presence that connected the destroyed house's genetics to the God Emperor's consciousness, the presence that made the Harkonnen contribution a component of the consciousness that governed the known universe for 3,500 years. Leto II was the Baron's great-grandson. The genetic connection, the contribution the breeding program's management had introduced into the Atreides bloodline, was carried in Leto's genetics alongside the Atreides contribution and the other genetic components the breeding program's configurations had combined. The Baron's presence was in Leto's other memory. The ancestral personality, the same personality that had displaced Elia's consciousness, was accessible in Leto's other memory alongside the other ancestral presences the preborn consciousness encompassed. The presence was there. The presence was not dominant, was not the assertive force that the presence had been in Elia's consciousness, was not the displacing personality that the presence had been in the abomination's experience. Leto managed the presence. The God Emperor's consciousness developed through the preborn condition's awareness and sustained through the sandworm transformation's enhanced capabilities. Managed the ancestral presence's population with the comprehensiveness the consciousness's development provided. The management included the Baron, included the maintenance of the ancestral personality within the consciousness's managed landscape, included the constraint of the personality's assertive tendencies within the management's controlled parameters. The management was the difference between Leto and Elia. Elia was overwhelmed. Leto managed. The difference was the consciousness's development was the product of the developmental conditions the respective consciousnesses had experienced, was the consequence of the formation the consciousness's growth had been conducted within. The Baron's presence in the managed consciousness was the Baron's final condition, the condition of the ancestral personality constrained within the consciousness the personality could not overwhelm. The Baron was there. The Baron was contained. The containment was the management's achievement, the accomplishment of the consciousness whose development had produced the capability the management required. The containment was the governance philosophy's final irony, the philosophy that had treated persons as instruments, that had managed persons through the manipulation the instrumentalism employed, was the philosophy whose practitioner was now the contained presence within another consciousness's managed landscape. The Baron had managed persons. The Baron was now managed. The instrument had become the instrumented. The manipulator had become the managed. The irony extended across the millennia. The Baron's contained presence accompanied Leto's governance for 3,500 years, was the managed element within the consciousness that governed the known universe across the timescale the Golden Path required. The Baron's political intelligence, the capability that had managed the Harkonnen House's competitive operations for decades, was present within the consciousness that governed the civilization's comprehensive operations for millennia. The decade's operator was contained within the millennia's governor. The smaller was encompassed by the larger, the competitive was encompassed by the comprehensive. The Harkonnen governance philosophy, examined across its full institutional expression, was the philosophy that treated the world as the raw material and the governance as the manufacturing process. The philosophy said, the world provides materials. The governance converts the materials into products. The products serve the governor's purposes. The purposes justify the conversion. The philosophy's logic was the logic of the industrial process applied to the political domain. The industrial process took raw materials and converted them into finished goods. The governance took resources, populations, and institutions and converted them into the outcomes the governance's purposes required. The conversion was the governance's function. The function was the philosophy's content. The content did not include the assessment. The philosophy that treated the world as raw material did not assess the world's value beyond the material's utility, did not evaluate the environment's integrity, the population's well-being, the institution's legitimacy as dimensions the governance should maintain alongside the production the governance pursued. The dimensions were absent from the philosophy's content. The absence was the philosophy's limitation. The limitation was not perceived as a limitation. The Harkonnens did not experience the absence as the deficiency the external assessment identified, did not perceive the missing dimensions as the qualities the governance should include. The Harkonnens experienced the absence as the efficiency. As the governance is streamlined, focus on the production the philosophy specified, as the administration's concentration on the outcomes the philosophy valued. The efficiency was real. The Harkonnen governance was productive. The spice production on Arrakis was maintained at the levels the CHOAM framework required. The industrial output on Giedi Prime was sustained at the volumes the commercial markets demanded. The governance produced. The production was the efficiency's evidence. The efficiency was also the blindness. The governance that produced did not see what the production consumed, did not perceive the environmental degradation the production generated, did not recognize the social conditions the production imposed, did not assess the human costs the production's operations produced. The production was visible. The consumption was invisible. The invisibility was the efficiency's cost. The price, the focused production extracted from the dimensions the focus excluded. The Harkonnen institutional culture was the culture the governance philosophy generated in the persons and the practices the governance encompassed, the set of behaviors, values, and norms the philosophy produced in the population the philosophy governed. The culture was competitive, the institutional environment the governance maintained. The conditions the governance philosophy's deployment produced was the environment in which the competition was the primary social dynamic. The persons within the institution competed for the position, the favour, the resources the governance's hierarchical distribution provided. The competition was managed. The Baron and the househeads who preceded the Baron managed the competition the institutional culture sustained. The management was deliberate, was the governance's use of the internal competition as the mechanism through which the institution's members' capabilities were assessed, and the institution's operations quality was maintained. The management served the governance. The internal competition that identified the capable and eliminated the incapable was the competition that produced the institutional members whose capabilities the governance's operations required. The competition was the selection, the mechanism through which the governance's personnel were tested against the conditions the competition imposed, and the survivors' capabilities were confirmed by the competition's outcomes. The competition was also corrosive. The institutional culture that sustained the internal competition was the culture that maintained the internal hostility the competition generated. The suspicion, the betrayal, the continuous assessment of the other members' vulnerabilities that the competition's dynamics produced. The culture was hostile. The culture was effective. The hostility and the effectiveness coexisted, were both the competition's products, were both the institutional culture's characteristics. The coexistence was the culture's most consequential quality. The culture produced the capable through the hostility, generated the operatives whose capabilities exceeded what the less demanding cultures produced, refined the persons whose skills the competition's pressure developed. The culture also consumed the capable through the hostility, eliminated the capable whose elimination the competition's dynamics produced, destroyed the persons whose capabilities the competition's outcomes did not protect. The consumption was the culture's waste. The capable persons the competition eliminated, the institutional members whose capabilities the competition's dynamics removed from the institution's operational resources, were the waste the institutional culture's competitive character generated. The waste was the culture's cost, the price the competitive dynamics extracted from the institutional resources the dynamics processed. The Baron managed the waste. The governance's management of the internal competition included the management of the competition's casualties, the attention to the competition's eliminations that the governance's personnel planning required. The management was the governance's acknowledgement that the competition's dynamics consumed the resources the dynamics were supposed to produce. The recognition that the institutional culture's competitive character generated the costs the culture's benefits had to exceed for the culture's maintenance to be justified. The arena culture was the institutional culture's recreational expression, the form the governance philosophy's values took in the cultural practices the governance maintained for the population's entertainment. The arenas on Giedi Prime were the venues the gladiatorial combat was conducted in, the physical facilities the governance maintained for the spectacle the entertainment's programming provided. The arenas were large. The arenas were central. The arenas were the governance's most visible recreational infrastructure. The combat was lethal. The fighters in the arenas fought to the death, conducted the combat the entertainment's programming specified with the lethality the spectacle's content demanded. The lethality was the entertainment's character, was the quality that made the spectacle the cathartic experience the population's emotional needs the governance's social management addressed. The fighters were the persons the governance provided, the persons who fought in the arenas, who conducted the lethal combat the spectacle's content required, were the persons the governance's institutional mechanisms had identified, trained, and deployed for the entertainment's purposes. The identification was institutional, was conducted through the governance's administrative apparatus, was managed through the mechanisms the governance's personnel allocation maintained. The deployment was instrumental. The persons deployed in the arenas were treated as the instruments the entertainment required, were managed as the resources the spectacle consumed, were administered as the inputs the entertainment's production processed. The instrumental treatment was the governance philosophy's application to the entertainment's dimension, the instrumentalism deployed in the recreational as it was deployed in the economic and the political. Feyd-Rauther's participation in the arena combat was the governance philosophy's most politically consequential recreational expression. The Heirs arena fights, the public demonstrations of the Heirs' combat capability the House's political presentation included, were the fights that connected the entertainment spectacle to the succession's political narrative. The fights were managed. Some opponents were given drugs that impaired the opponent's capabilities, substances that reduced the opponent's combat effectiveness to the levels the managed outcome required. The management ensured the outcomes produced the victories the political presentation demanded, generated the demonstrations the succession's narrative specified. The management was discovered. Paul, during the political confrontation the revolution's military success had produced, referenced the managed fight's character. The reference exposed the management, revealed the manipulation the political presentation had concealed, demonstrated the instrumentalism the entertainment's operations had employed. The exposure was the governance philosophy's vulnerability expressed in the entertainment's dimension. The philosophy whose operations depended on the concealment the instrumentalism required was the philosophy whose exposure undermined the operations the concealment sustained. The fight's management was exposed. The exposure undermined the political presentation the management had sustained. The undermining was the concealment's failure. The consequence the exposure produced when the concealment's maintenance could not be sustained. The Harkonnen approach to intelligence was the approach that connected the governance philosophy to the information management the governance's competitive operations required. The intelligence operations were extensive. The Harkonnen House maintained the intelligence apparatus the governance's competitive position demanded. The operatives, the networks, the analytical processing the information the governance required was collected and assessed through. The apparatus was the governance's informational infrastructure, the mechanism through which the governance's awareness of the political landscape was maintained and the governance's strategic assessments were informed. The intelligence was directed against the rivals. The Atreides, the house whose feud with the Harkonnens the 10,000-year rivalry sustained, were the intelligence operations' primary target. The operations monitored the Atreides, collected the information the rivalry's competitive dynamics required, assessed the Atreides' capabilities and vulnerabilities, identified the opportunities the intelligence's analysis revealed. The intelligence was also directed internally. The governance philosophy's competitive institutional culture, the environment in which the internal competition the governance sustained operated, generated the intelligence requirements the internal operations addressed. The internal intelligence monitored the institutional members, assessed the members' loyalties, evaluated the members' capabilities, identified the internal threats the competition's dynamics produced. The dual direction, the external intelligence against the rivals and the internal intelligence against the institutional members, was the governance philosophy's informational expression. The philosophy that treated persons as instruments required the information the intelligence provided, required the awareness of the person's capabilities and vulnerabilities the intelligence's collection and analysis generated. The intelligence's most consequential failure was the failure to assess the Fremen. The governance's intelligence apparatus, directed against the rivals and the internal members the governance philosophy specified, did not encompass the Fremen's assessment in the intelligence's operational scope. The Fremen were not the rivals. The Fremen were not the internal members. The Fremen were the population, were the governed rather than the governing, were the managed rather than the managing. The governance philosophy did not assess the managed. The philosophy assessed the managing, assessed the competitors, the institutional members, the persons whose capabilities the competitive dynamics required the assessment of. The managed were the resources, were the inputs the governance processed, were the materials the production consumed. The resources were not assessed for their capabilities. The resources were assessed for their productivity. The distinction was the intelligence failure's source, the governance philosophy's categorical treatment of the managed as the resources rather than as the persons whose capabilities the assessment should have encompassed. The failure was comprehensive. The intelligence apparatus that monitored the Atreides across the known universe, that maintained the operatives and the networks the rivalries, competitive dynamics required, did not monitor the civilization that inhabited the desert beyond the shield wall. The apparatus did not know the Fremen's population numbers. The apparatus did not know the Fremen's military capabilities. The apparatus did not know the Fremen's organizational structure. The apparatus did not know the Fremen's ecological knowledge. The not knowing was the governance philosophy's most consequential institutional product. The philosophy that categorized the population as the resource produced the intelligence apparatus that did not assess the population as the force. The categorization produced the gap. The gap produced the vulnerability. The vulnerability was exploited by the revolution the gap had concealed. Lankivel was the Harkonnen ancestral world, the cold ocean-dominated planet whose conditions and whose economy were dramatically different from the industrial powerhouse the house's current governance was based on. Lankivel was modest. The planet's economy, organized around the fishing and the small-scale resource extraction the planet's conditions supported, was the economy whose scale made the planet an unremarkable presence in the Imperium's commercial landscape. The modesty was the contrast, the difference between what the house had been and what the house had become. Between the cold fisheries the ancestral connection encompassed and the industrial empire the current governance maintained, Raban held Lankivel. The older nephew's governance of the ancestral world was the governance the family's administrative portfolio included alongside the more consequential governance the house's primary operations encompassed. The governance was minor. Was the administration of the modest economy the modest planet's conditions supported? Was the management of the unremarkable operations the unremarkable world's resources generated? The contrast between Lankivel and Giedi Prime was the contrast the house's institutional development had produced. The difference between the world the house had originated from and the world the house had developed into the base the institutional power was maintained from. The origin was cold and modest. The base was industrial and powerful. The development from the origin to the base was the house's institutional trajectory. The progression from the minor house on the cold world to the major house on the industrial world. The trajectory was the governance philosophy's development made geographical. The house that originated on the cold fishing world did not develop the governance philosophy the industrial world would produce. The fishing world's conditions did not generate the instrumentalist approach the industrial economy's conditions would sustain. The governance philosophy was the industrial world's product, was generated by the conditions the industrial economy imposed, was developed through the institutional culture the industrial operations demands produced. The governance philosophy's absence on Lankivel was the philosophy's environmental dependency demonstrated. The philosophy was not the house's inherent character. The philosophy was the environment's product, was generated by the conditions the environment provided, was developed through the institutional responses the conditions demanded. A different environment produced a different philosophy. The cold fishing world's conditions produced a different institutional character than the industrial world's conditions generated. The environmental dependency was the saga's argument about the relationship between the world and the institution applied to the Harkonnen house's institutional development. The argument said, the world shapes the institution. The institution reflects the world. The Harkonnen governance philosophy reflected Giedi Prime. The philosophy was Giedi Prime's product. The philosophy would have been different if the house had remained on Lankyvale. The Harkonnen Atreides contrast was the Imperium's most sustained institutional comparison, the 10,000-year demonstration of two governance traditions differing approaches to the same institutional challenges. The contrast was not absolute. The characterization of the Harkonnens as the pure evil and the Atreides as the pure good was the simplification the political landscape's observers sometimes produced, the reduction of the institutional comparison to the moral binary the simplification's logic generated. The characterization was inaccurate, did not encompass the complexity the actual institution's operations demonstrated, did not account for the dimensions the binary's categories excluded. The Harkonnens were not evil in the metaphysical sense the term's strongest usage implied. The house was instrumental, was the institution whose governance tradition treated the world's components as the materials the governance processed rather than as the values the governance preserved. The instrumentalism was not the metaphysical evil. The instrumentalism was the institutional approach, was the governance tradition's method, was the administrative philosophy's content, was the institutional culture's character. The Atreides were not good in the metaphysical sense the term's strongest usage implied. The house was service-oriented, was the institution whose governance tradition treated the governance's purpose as the govern's benefit rather than as the governor's enrichment. The service orientation was not the metaphysical good. The service orientation was the institutional approach, was the governance tradition's method, was the administrative philosophy's content, was the institutional culture's character. The comparison between the two approaches was the comparison the Imperium's political landscape sustained as the ongoing assessment of the two governance traditions' relative merits. The assessment was not conducted in the abstract, was not the theoretical evaluation the philosophical discourse would have provided. The assessment was conducted through the observation. Through the political landscape's actors' evaluation of the two traditions' operational results, through the comparison of the governance outcomes the two traditions generated. The Landsraad's assessment favoured the Atreides. The political actors whose evaluation of the two traditions the Landsraad's collective judgment constituted preferred the Atreides tradition. Assessed the service orientation's governance as the superior approach, evaluated the governance's benefit tradition as the more admirable method. The preference was the assessment's product, was generated by the comparison's outcomes rather than by the comparison's theoretical merits. The preference threatened the Harkonnens. The Landsraad's preference for the Atreides tradition was the political landscape's assessment that the Harkonnen tradition was inferior, was the collective judgment that the exploitation's governance was less admirable than the service's governance. The judgment's political consequences, the influence the preference conferred on the preferred, and the disadvantage the preference imposed on the not preferred were the consequences the Harkonnens' political position had to manage. The management was the Baron's political operation, was the sustained effort to maintain the house's competitive position despite the Landsraad's preferential assessment of the rival's tradition. The management was conducted through the mechanisms the governance philosophy's instrumentalism provided, through the manipulation, the leverage, the strategic manoeuvring the instrumentalism's methods encompassed. The management was effective. The Harkonnens maintained the competitive position despite the Landsraad's preference for the Atreides. sustained the house's political standing through the methods the governance philosophy provided, managed the disadvantage the preference imposed through the operational capabilities the institutional culture produced. The effectiveness and the preference coexisted. The Harkonnens were effective despite being less preferred. The Atreides were preferred despite being less effective in some competitive dimensions. The coexistence was the political landscape's complexity, the reality that the preference and the effectiveness were different qualities, that the preferred was not necessarily the more effective, and the effective was not necessarily the more preferred. The Baron's political operations were the operations that demonstrated the governance philosophy's methods in the political landscape's competitive dimension. The sustained activities the governance philosophy's instrumentalism produced in the institutional environment the Landsraad's dynamics constituted. The operations were comprehensive. The Baron's political activities encompassed the dimensions the competitive position's maintenance required, the alliances the competitive dynamics demanded, the intelligence the competitive assessments required, the manipulation the competitive interactions employed. The alliances were instrumental. The Baron's relationships with the other houses, the political connections the competitive landscape's navigation required, were managed through the instrumentalism the governance philosophy provided. The alliances served the house's purposes. The alliances were maintained while the purposes were served. The alliances were abandoned when the purposes were no longer served. The management was the instrumentalism's application to the political relationships, the treatment of the alliances as the instruments the competitive dynamics deployed. The intelligence supported the operations. The information the intelligence apparatus collected, the awareness of the political landscape's dynamics the intelligence's analysis produced, was the informational foundation the operations planning was conducted on. The intelligence was comprehensive in the competitive dimension, encompassed the rivals' activities, the allies' reliabilities, the landscape's opportunities and threats. The manipulation was the operation's primary method. The Baron's political interactions, the engagements with the other actors the political landscape's dynamics produced, were conducted through the manipulation the governance philosophy's instrumentalism employed. The interactions were managed, were directed toward the outcomes the manipulation's deployment was designed to produce, were controlled through the leverage the manipulation's methods identified and exploited. The Baron's most consequential political operation was the conspiracy with Shaddam IV. The operation, the coordinated destruction of the Atreides household on Arrakis, was the governance philosophy's most dramatic deployment. The operation treated the political landscape's components, the Emperor's anxieties, the Atreides' vulnerabilities, the military force's capabilities, as the instruments the operation's design specified. The components were manipulated. The manipulation produced the outcomes. The outcomes were the operation's products. The products were the governance philosophy's most consequential political achievement and the governance philosophy's most consequential political failure. The achievement was the Atreides household's destruction, the elimination of the rival the 10,000-year feud had sustained. The failure was the elimination's incompleteness, the survival of Jessica and Paul that the destruction's comprehensiveness had not managed to prevent. The incompleteness was the failure that consumed the achievement. The destruction's comprehensiveness was almost complete. The almost was the gap. The gap produced the consequences. The consequences produced the revolution. The revolution destroyed the house. The achievement was consumed by the failure the achievement's incompleteness had produced. The economic dimensions of House Harkonnen were the dimensions that connected the governance philosophy to the commercial activities the philosophy's instrumentalism generated, the financial operations the House maintained alongside the political operations the governance conducted. The House was wealthy. The Harkonnen economic position, sustained through the industrial operations on Giedi Prime and the spice revenue from Arrakis, was the economic position whose magnitude made the House one of the Imperium's wealthiest institutional actors. The wealth was the governance philosophy's economic product, was generated through the instrumentalist approach the governance applied to the economic activities the wealth's accumulation required. The spice revenue was the economic position's most consequential component. The Arrakis governance, the 80-year administration of the spice production the fief assignment had provided, generated the revenue the commercial distribution produced. The revenue was enormous, exceeded what the Giedi Prime industrial operations alone could have generated, provided the economic foundation the House's political operations required. The revenue's loss, the consequence of the Atreides transfer the Emperor's conspiracy had arranged, was the economic motivation the conspiracy's Harkonnen participation required. The Baron participated in the conspiracy to recover the revenue, to restore the economic position the Arrakis governance had provided, to reclaim the commercial benefits the fief's administration generated. The economic motivation was the governance philosophy's expression in the conspiracy's dimension. The philosophy that treated the world as the raw material the governance processed treated the spice revenue as the economic product the governance was designed to generate. The revenue's loss was the product's loss. The product's recovery was the governance's purpose. The conspiracy was the recovery's mechanism. The House's economic operations extended beyond the spice revenue. The Giedi Prime industrial economy, the manufacturing, and the extraction the planet's production encompassed was the economic activity the House maintained alongside the Arrakis operations. The industrial economy was productive, generated the commercial output the markets consumed, sustained the employment the population's economic activity required, maintained the economic conditions the governance's institutional operations depended on. The industrial economy was also exploitative. The production's conditions, the labor conditions, the environmental conditions, the social conditions the industrial operations generated were the conditions the governance philosophy's instrumentalism produced. The conditions were harsh. The conditions were productive. The harshness and the productivity coexisted, were both the governance philosophy's economic products, were both the instrumentalism's consequences in the economic dimension. The House's role in the Imperium's political balance was the role the Corrino dynasty assigned to the House within the political landscape's managed dynamics, the function the House served in the dynasty's administration of the Landsraad's institutional relationships. The balance was managed. The Corrino dynasty maintained the Landsraad's political dynamics at the calibrated intensity the dynasty's governance required, sustained the rivalries, the alliances, the competitive relationships the political landscape consisted of at the levels the governance's stability demanded. The management was the dynasty's most sustained political practice, was the ongoing calibration of the political dynamics the governance's continuation required. The Harkonnen-Atreides rivalry was part of the balance. The dynasty maintained the rivalry, sustained the competition between the two houses at the intensity the balance's calibration specified, managed the feud's dynamics within the parameters the governance's stability accommodated. The maintenance was deliberate, was the dynasty's institutional decision to sustain the rivalry rather than to resolve it, to maintain the competition rather than to eliminate it. The maintenance served the dynasty. The rivalry that occupied the two houses' institutional energies, that consumed the competitive resources the rivalry's dynamics required, was the rivalry that distracted the houses from the dynasty's governance. The distraction was the maintenance's purpose, was the function the sustained rivalry served in the dynasty's management of the political landscape's dynamics. The Harkonnens served the balance as the rival. The house whose competitive operations the feud sustained was the house whose institutional energies the feud consumed. The consumption was the balance's mechanism, the mechanism through which the dynasty managed the house's competitive potential by directing the potential toward the rival rather than toward the dynasty. The service was not recognized. The Harkonnens did not perceive the house's role in the balance, did not recognize the dynasty's management of the feud as the mechanism the dynasty's governance employed. The Harkonnens perceived the feud as the house's institutional rivalry, rather than as the dynasty's managed competition. The non-perception was the management's success, the demonstration that the dynasty's calibration of the rivalry was conducted with the discretion the management's effectiveness required. The management's disruption, the event that changed the balance's calibrated dynamics, was the Emperor's conspiracy. Shaddam's decision to use the rivalry for the Atreides' destruction disrupted the balance, converted the managed competition into the operational conspiracy, transformed the calibrated rivalry into the destructive collaboration. The disruption was the dynasty's most consequential political error, the decision that converted the managed dynamic into the unmanaged consequence. The consequence was the revolution. The disrupted balance produced the conditions the revolution exploited. The collaboration that destroyed the Atreides produced the survival that generated the revolution. The revolution destroyed the dynasty alongside the Harkonnens. The balance's disruption consumed the balance's manager alongside the balance's managed. The Harkonnen house's relationship with the Spacing Guild was the relationship that connected the house's commercial operations to the guild's navigational monopoly. The institutional interaction the commercial activities' transportation requirements generated. The relationship was commercial. The house's economic operations, the spice distribution from Arrakis, the industrial output from Giedi Prime required the Guild's navigational service for the transportation the commercial distribution demanded. The requirement was the relationship's foundation, the commercial need the house's economic activities imposed on the relationship's institutional dynamics. The Guild's relationship with the Harkonnen governance of Arrakis was the relationship's most consequential dimension. The Guild consumed the spice, the Harkonnens produced the spice. The consumer-producer relationship created the institutional dynamic the relationship's commercial dimension encompassed. The dynamic included the pricing. The negotiation of the transportation costs the Guild's service charged, and the production costs the Harkonnen governance incurred. The dynamic included the supply, the reliability of the spice provision the Guild's consumption required, and the production management the reliability demanded. The Guild cooperated with the Fremen. The navigational institution's interest in the Fremen's concealment, the Guild's agreement to misrepresent the satellite observations that would have revealed the Fremen's population numbers, was the cooperation that connected the Guild's institutional interests to the Fremen's survival. The cooperation was motivated by the spice, by the Fremen's bribery payments the Guild's institutional consumption benefited from, by the commercial relationship the payments sustained. The cooperation meant the Guild was concealing the Fremen from the Harkonnens, the navigational monopoly that the Harkonnen house depended on for the commercial operations transportation was the institution that was hiding the population whose capabilities would eventually destroy the Harkonnen house. The concealment was the guild's institutional decision, was the determination that the Fremen's concealment served the guild's interests more effectively than the Fremen's exposure would have. The concealment contributed to the intelligence failure, the Harkonnen governance's inability to assess the Fremen's population, the intelligence gap that the governance philosophy's categorical treatment of the managed as the resources had produced was reinforced by the guild's deliberate concealment of the satellite data the population assessment would have required. The governance philosophy's blindness and the guild's concealment combined to produce the comprehensive intelligence failure the revolution exploited. The combination demonstrated the consequences' convergence. The governance philosophy produced the blindness. The guild produced the concealment. The blindness and the concealment together produced the intelligence failure. The intelligence failure produced the vulnerability. The vulnerability was exploited by the revolution. The revolution destroyed the house. The convergence of the multiple institutional dynamics, the governance philosophy's blindness, the guild's concealment, the intelligence apparatus's categorical limitations, produced the combined consequence the individual dynamics' separate effects could not have generated. The Harkonnen tradition's philosophical argument, the argument the tradition embodied rather than the argument the tradition stated, was the argument about the relationship between effectiveness and morality that the governance philosophy's sustained operation demonstrated. The argument said, effectiveness and morality are separate qualities. The governance can be effective without being moral. The governance can be moral without being effective. The qualities are independent, are produced by different dimensions of the governance's operation, are generated by different aspects of the governance's institutional character. The Harkonnen tradition demonstrated the first claim. The governance was effective, produced the commercial outputs the economy required, maintained the competitive position the political landscape demanded, managed the institutional operations the house's continuation depended on. The governance was not moral, did not include the govern's well-being in the governance's objectives, did not assess the governance's operations through the moral framework the govern's interests would have informed. The Atreides tradition demonstrated the second claim. The governance was moral, included the govern's well-being in the governance's objectives, assessed the governance's operations through the framework the govern's interests informed. The governance was also effective, produced the institutional outcomes the house's continuation required, maintained the competitive position the political landscape demanded. The comparison between the two demonstrations complicated the argument. The Atreides tradition demonstrated that the governance could be both effective and moral, that the two qualities were not incompatible, that the moral governance could also be the effective governance. The demonstration undermined the Harkonnen tradition's implicit claim that the morality's absence was the effectiveness's condition, that the governance had to be amoral to be effective, that the moral concern reduced the governance's productivity. The undermining was the comparison's most consequential philosophical product. The comparison showed that the Harkonnen tradition's effectiveness was not the product of the tradition's amorality, that the effectiveness could be achieved alongside the morality, that the governance's productivity did not require the govern's exploitation. The comparison demonstrated that the exploitation was unnecessary, that the outcomes the exploitation produced could be produced through the methods the exploitation's absence employed. The unnecessariness was the Harkonnen tradition's philosophical condemnation. The tradition was not condemned because the tradition was immoral. The immorality alone was the moral assessment rather than the philosophical argument. The tradition was condemned because the tradition was unnecessarily immoral. because the exploitation the tradition employed was the exploitation the alternative tradition demonstrated was not required for the outcomes the exploitation generated. The condemnation was the saga's philosophical verdict on the Harkonnen governance philosophy. The verdict said, the exploitation is not necessary. The alternative exists. The alternative produces the comparable outcomes without the exploitation's moral costs. The exploitation's persistence, despite the alternative's availability, is the exploitation's condemnation. The House as Herbert's commentary on power was the dimension that connected the Harkonnen institutional character to the saga's argument about the nature of political power and the consequences the power's exercise produced. The commentary said, the power that is exercised through exploitation produces the consequences that consume the exploiters. The commentary used the Harkonnens to demonstrate the claim, showed the exploitation's consequences returning to the exploiters through the mechanisms the exploitation had generated. The Baron exploited. The Baron's governance treated the world's components as the instruments the governance deployed. The exploitation produced the consequences. The consequences included the revolution. The revolution destroyed the Baron. The exploitation's consequences consumed the exploiter. The pattern was the commentary's content. The commentary did not state the pattern, did not declare the exploitation's consequences return through the exposition's direct address. The commentary demonstrated the pattern, showed the exploitation's operation, showed the consequences' development, showed the consequences' return to the source. The demonstration was the argument. The pattern was the thesis. The thesis was not the simplistic claim that the evil were punished. The thesis was the structural claim that the exploitation generated the conditions that produced the exploitation's consequences. The claim was not moral, was not the assertion that the universe arranged the retribution the exploitation warranted. The claim was structural, was the assertion that the exploitation's operations produced the dynamics consequences encompassed. The structural claim was more powerful than the moral claim. The moral claim said, the exploiters deserve the consequences. The structural claim said, the exploiters produce the consequences. The structural claim did not require the moral assessment. The structural claim described the mechanism. The mechanism operated regardless of the assessment. The Baron did not deserve the consequences in the cosmic sense the moral claim implied. The Baron produced the consequences in the structural sense the structural claim described. The production was the mechanism's operation, was the causal chain the exploitation's activities initiated, and the activity's consequences followed. The chain ran from the exploitation through the consequences back to the exploiter. The chain was structural. The chain was the commentary's content. Peter de Vries was the Harkonnen household's most fully documented institutional member alongside the Baron, the mentat whose service to the house demonstrated the governance philosophy's application to the cognitive institution the mentat tradition constituted. Peter was a mentat, was the human computer whose trained cognitive capability served the governance the house's political operations required. Peter's capability was the mentat tradition's product, was the analytical processing the training developed, was the computational function the cognitive development produced. Peter was also twisted. The mentat whose cognitive capability the training had produced was the mentat whose character the Harkonnen institutional culture had shaped, whose personality reflected the governance philosophy's instrumentalism, whose values expressed the institutional culture's competitive hostility, whose operational style embodied the manipulation the governance tradition employed. The twisting was the institutional culture's product. Peter's character was not the mentat tradition's product, was not the quality the cognitive training generated in the persons the training developed. Peter's character was the Harkonnen institutional culture's product, was the quality the competitive environment generated in the person the environment encompassed. The distinction between the training's product and the culture's product was the distinction the Mentat tradition's institutional history encompassed. The distinction between the cognitive capability the training developed and the moral character the institutional environment shaped. The training developed the capability. The environment shaped the character. The capability and the character were the different products of the different institutional contributions. Thufir Hawat, the Atreides Mentat, was the comparison's demonstration. Hawat's cognitive capability was comparable to Piter's, was the Mentat training's product, developed to the levels the training's institutional demands specified. Hawat's character was different from Piter's, reflected the Atreides institutional culture rather than the Harkonnen institutional culture, expressed the service orientation rather than the instrumentalism, embodied the loyalty the governance as service tradition generated rather than the manipulation the governance as exploitation tradition employed. The comparison demonstrated that the Mentat's character was the institutional culture's product rather than the cognitive training's product, demonstrated that the same training could produce the different characters when the training was conducted within the different institutional environments. Piter was Piter because Piter served the Harkonnens. Hawat was Hawat because Hawat served the Atreides. The service's institutional context determined the character the service produced. Piter's death was the governance philosophy's consequence in the personal dimension. The Mentat whose service the Baron had utilized was the Mentat whose death the Baron's strategic calculations permitted. The person whose elimination the Baron's assessment of the elimination's strategic benefits justified. The Baron could sacrifice Piter because the Baron treated Piter as the instrument. The instrument could be discarded when the instrument's utility was exhausted. The discarding was the instrumentalism's application to the person the instrumentalism encompassed. The Harkonnen soldiers were the governance philosophy's military expression, the military force whose character reflected the institutional culture the force was produced within. The soldiers were competent. The Harkonnen military tradition, the training, the equipment, the organizational structure the House's military operations maintained, produced the soldiers whose combat capability met the standards the Imperium's military landscape demanded. The competence was the tradition's product, was generated by the training the tradition provided, was sustained by the institutional investment the military's operations required. The soldiers were also dispensable. The governance philosophy that treated persons as instruments treated the soldiers as the instruments the military operations deployed, as the resources the combat consumed, as the inputs the military's production processed. The dispensability was the instrumentalism's military expression, the treatment of the military personnel as the resources the operations utilized rather than as the persons the operations encompassed. The dispensability's contrast with the Atreides military tradition was the contrast the political landscape's military comparison documented. The Atreides treated the soldiers as persons, as the members of the household the governance as service tradition valued, as the participants in the institutional community the loyalty tradition sustained. The Harkonnens treated the soldiers as instruments, as the resources the operations consumed, as the inputs the combat processed. The contrast produced the loyalty differential. The Atreides soldiers were loyal, were committed to the household the service tradition's reciprocal relationship sustained. The Harkonnen soldiers were compliant, were obedient to the governance the hierarchical authority maintained. The loyalty and the compliance were different qualities. The loyalty was the voluntary commitment the reciprocal relationship generated. The compliance was the obligatory obedience the hierarchical authority imposed. The difference was consequential in the crisis. The loyalty sustained the commitment through the crisis the external pressures produced, maintained the soldiers' engagement with the household through the conditions the crisis's disruptions generated. The compliance failed in the crisis, dissolved when the hierarchical authority the compliance depended on was disrupted by the crisis's conditions. The loyalty's sustainability and the compliance's fragility were demonstrated in the battle for Arrakis. The Atreides retainers' loyalty, maintained through the household's destruction and the desert period's hardships, was the loyalty that sustained the individual commitments the revolution's military force included. The Harkonnen soldiers' compliance, maintained through the hierarchical authority the governance's operations sustained, was the compliance that failed when the revolution's military force overwhelmed the authority the compliance depended on. The Harkonnen house in the Imperium's institutional memory, the house as remembered after the house's political destruction, was the house whose legacy the institutional memory's assessment produced. The institutional memory remembered the exploitation. The political landscape's actors, the houses, the institutions, the governance's administrators, whose assessment the institutional memory constituted, remembered the Harkonnen governance philosophy's character. The memory was the assessment, was the evaluation the political landscape's observers produced from the governance's documented operations, was the judgment the observer's assessment generated from the exploitation's observed consequences. The assessment was negative. The institutional memory assessed the Harkonnen tradition as the governance tradition whose methods were condemned by the method's consequences, assessed the exploitation's governance as the governance whose products included the destruction the exploitation generated. The assessment was the verdict, was the institutional memory's evaluation of the governance tradition's merits conducted through the consequences observation. The verdict was the governance philosophy's legacy. The philosophy that treated the world as the raw material the governance processed was the philosophy whose legacy was the assessment that the processing consumed the world the processing was applied to. The legacy was the condemnation, was the institutional memory's judgment that the governance philosophy's methods produced the consequences the method's practitioners could not survive. The condemnation was the pattern's expression. The exploitation produced the consequences. The consequences consumed the exploiters. The consumption was the pattern. The pattern was the legacy. The legacy was the condemnation. The condemnation was also the lesson. The institutional memory's assessment of the Harkonnen governance philosophy was the assessment that produced the lesson the assessment's content constituted. The lesson that the exploitation's governance generated the consequences the exploitation's practitioners could not survive, that the instrumentalism's methods produced the dynamics the method's deployers could not control. The lesson was the Harkonnen House's most consequential institutional contribution. The contribution the House's institutional history made to the political landscape's accumulated understanding through the history's consequences demonstration. The contribution was not intentional. The Harkonnens did not intend the lesson the House's history produced. The contribution was structural, was generated by the history's events pattern rather than by the history's actors' purposes. The 10,000-year history of House Harkonnen was the history of the pattern, the sustained, institutionally maintained, philosophically grounded pattern of the exploitation that produced the consequences that consumed the exploiters. The pattern was present in every era the House's history encompassed. The early Harkonnens' competitive operations generated the consequences the early operations' competitive dynamics produced. The middle Harkonnens' institutional development generated the consequences the development's industrial character produced. The Baron's governance generated the consequences the governance's instrumentalist approach produced. The pattern was present throughout, was the recurring dynamic the institutional philosophy's sustained operation generated across the millennia the philosophy's maintenance encompassed. The pattern's persistence was the philosophy's persistence's product. The philosophy was maintained across the millennia. The philosophy's maintenance sustained the pattern's operation. The pattern's operation produced the consequences the pattern's dynamics generated. The consequences accumulated. The accumulation produced the destruction the final era's events constituted. The destruction was the pattern's culmination, the point at which the accumulated consequences exceeded the institutional resilience the House's operations maintained. The consequences that had been generated across the millennia of the philosophy's operation, the hostilities, the resentments, the competitive responses the exploitation had produced in the House's institutional environment, converged in the revolution's military and political events. The convergence was the destruction. The destruction was the pattern's completion. The completion was not the ending. The Harkonnen genetics survived, persisted in the Atreides bloodline the breeding program's management had connected the genetics to. The genetics carried the House's biological contribution forward despite the House's political destruction. The biological legacy persisted while the political legacy ended. The persistence was the genetics' quality, the quality that made the biological contribution more durable than the political operation the contribution's source had maintained. The genetics persisted because the genetics operated through the biological transmission rather than through the institutional management. The transmission was biological, was conducted through the reproductive processes the biology encompassed, rather than through the institutional practices the governance maintained. The biological persistence was the House's most ironic legacy. The genetics the Bene Gesserit's management had contributed to the Atreides bloodline, the genetic material the Baron did not know he had contributed to the rival House's biological lineage, was the material that persisted when the House the material originated from was destroyed. The contribution survived. The contributor did not. The survival was the breeding program's product. The non-survival was the governance philosophy's product. The two products coexisted. The survival and the non-survival were both present, both produced by the institutional dynamics the House's history encompassed, both generated by the mechanisms the history's events demonstrated. The genetics survived because the Bene Gesserit managed the genetics. The House did not survive because the governance philosophy produced the consequences the House could not survive. The coexistence was the history's final assessment. The biological was more durable than the political. The genetics outlasted the governance. The contribution persisted beyond the contributor. The material endured beyond the institution. The complete 10,000-year history of House Harkonnen. The House that treated everything as an instrument. The House whose instruments turned on the hands that wielded them. The House whose governance produced the consequences the governance could not survive. The House whose genetics persisted in the bloodline the House's political operations had been directed against. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen died at the hands of a child. The child was his granddaughter's daughter. The child was his blood. The blood killed the body. The consequence consumed the source. The pattern completed. The House ended. The genetics continued. The complete 10,000-year history of House Harkonnen, The Baron's schemes were the governance philosophy's operational expression in the political landscape's competitive dimension, the sustained strategic activities whose design reflected the intelligence the governance tradition had developed in the person the tradition had produced. The schemes were layered. The Baron did not operate through single-dimension strategies, did not pursue the objectives through the straightforward approaches the single-dimension design would have produced. The Baron operated through multi-layered designs, through the strategies whose surface operations concealed the deeper operations the surface was designed to obscure. The layering was the intelligence's expression. The mind that designed the multi-layered strategies was the mind whose capability exceeded the single layer's requirements, was the intelligence that could conceive the deeper operations alongside the surface operations, that could manage the deeper dimensions' concealment within the surface dimensions' visible activities, that could sustain the layered design's complexity across the duration the design's execution required. The layering was also the governance philosophy's expression. The instrumentalism that treated persons and situations as the instruments the governance deployed required the concealment the layering provided, required the surface that obscured the deeper operations from the persons the deeper operations were directed against. The concealment was necessary because the instrumentalism's effectiveness depended on the target's non-awareness of the instrumentalism's deployment. The targets who perceived the manipulation could resist the manipulation. The concealment prevented the perception. The prevention sustained the effectiveness. The Arrakis conspiracy was the layering's most consequential demonstration. The surface operation, the legitimate transfer of the Arrakis fief from the Harkonnens to the Atreides, concealed the deeper operation, the conspiracy to destroy the Atreides through the transfer's circumstances. The transfer appeared legitimate. The transfer was the trap. The appearance and the reality were the layers, the surface and the depth the design's structure encompassed. The layers included the Yueh dimension. The Sook doctor whose conditioning the Baron's agents had broken, whose loyalty the emotional leverage the captured wife provided had overwhelmed, was the layer the conspiracy's internal dimension included. The Yueh layer was the deepest, was the operation within the household the surface operation's external activities could not have reached. The Yueh layer's deployment was the governance philosophy's most personal expression. The doctor whose conditioning was supposed to be unbreakable, whose neurological commitment to the patient's well-being the Sook tradition's training had installed, was the doctor whose emotional vulnerability the governance philosophy's instrumentalism identified and exploited. The exploitation identified the vulnerability. The exploitation provided the leverage. The leverage produced the betrayal. The betrayal was the conspiracy's most consequential internal element. Yueh provided the access. Yueh disabled the defences. Yueh delivered the Duke to the Baron's capture. The delivery was the internal layer's contribution to the conspiracy's operation, the element the external layers could not have produced without the internal access the betrayal provided. The Baron also planned the Duke's death through Yueh. The poisoned tooth, the suicide mechanism Yueh installed in the Duke's mouth, was the weapon the internal layer equipped the captured Duke with. The weapon was intended for the Baron, was the mechanism through which Yueh's conflicted loyalty expressed the residual commitment to the Atreides alongside the betrayal the leverage had produced. The Duke deployed the weapon. The poisoned gas the tooth released was directed at the Baron. The Baron survived, was protected by the shield the Baron's precautionary measures maintained, was saved by the defence the political culture's sustained vigilance provided. The survival was the precaution's product, the consequence of the paranoia the competitive institutional culture sustained in the persons the culture encompassed. The near miss was the governance philosophy's vulnerabilities' nearest expression. The scheme that was designed to destroy the Atreides was the scheme that nearly destroyed the schemer. The plan whose execution included the element the planner's precaution barely managed to survive. The near miss was the pattern's preview. The early demonstration of the consequences returning to the source dynamic the revolution's events would complete. The Harkonnen household's internal dynamics were the dynamics the governance philosophy's competitive institutional culture produced in the persons the household encompassed, the relationships, the rivalries, the manipulations the internal environment generated. The dynamics were hostile. The household's internal environment, shaped by the governance philosophy's instrumentalism, sustained by the competitive culture's pressures, maintained by the Baron's management of the internal competition, was the environment in which the household's members' relationships were conducted through the suspicion and the manipulation the environment generated. The hostility was the Baron's tool. The Baron managed the household's internal dynamics, maintained the competition, sustained the hostility, calibrated the tensions the internal environment produced. The management served the governance's purposes, identified the capable through the competition's filtration, maintained the loyalty through the fear the hostility generated, managed the succession through the controlled rivalry the nephew's competition constituted. The nephew's rivalry was the internal dynamic's most consequential relationship. Rabban and Feyd-Rautha, the older and the younger, the brute and the cultivated, the first phase instrument and the second phase heir, were maintained in the rivalry the Baron's management sustained. The rivalry was managed, was calibrated to the intensity the management's purposes required, was maintained at the level the governance's succession planning specified. The management included the information asymmetry. The Baron shared different information with the different nephews, provided each with the knowledge the nephew's role required, while withholding the knowledge the nephew's role did not encompass. The asymmetry was the management's tool, was the mechanism through which the Baron's superior information maintained the Baron's superior position in the household's internal hierarchy. Rabban did not know the two-phase plan. The older nephew, deployed as the first phase's oppressive instrument, did not know the deployment was the plan's first phase rather than the plan's entirety. Rabban did not know Feyd-Rautha would replace him. Rabban did not know the oppression was the setup for the replacement's political exploitation. Rabban governed the first phase as the governance rather than as the phase, governed with the belief that the oppression was the Baron's permanent intention rather than the Baron's preliminary operation. The non-knowledge was the management's product. The Baron withheld the information because the information's provision would have compromised the first phase's operation. The Rabban who knew the replacement was coming would have governed the first phase differently from the Rabban who believed the oppression was permanent. The different governance would have reduced the first phase's effectiveness. The reduction would have compromised the second phase's political conditions. The non-knowledge sustained the operation. Feyd-Rautha knew more. The younger nephew, the heir the Baron was cultivating for the second phase's deployment, knew the first phase's preliminary character. The knowledge was the cultivation's component. Was the information the Baron provided alongside the political education the heir's development included. The knowledge positioned Feyd-Rautha within the plan's design, placed the heir in the informed position the second phase's deployment required. The differential knowledge was the manipulation's expression. The Baron manipulated both nephews, managed both through the information the management calibrated, controlled both through the knowledge the management distributed. The manipulation was the governance philosophy's application to the family, the instrumentalism deployed in the household's personal dimension alongside the instrumentalism deployed in the governance's political dimension. The Baron's relationship with Mohiam was the relationship that connected the governance philosophy's personal dimension to the breeding program's institutional operation. The relationship between the house's head and the sisterhood's representative, whose institutional purposes the relationship served. The relationship was coerced. The sexual encounter that produced the genetic contribution the breeding program required, the encounter through which Jessica's genetics were created, was the encounter the Bene Gesserit's institutional purposes demanded. Mohiam's participation was institutional, was conducted for the breeding program's purposes rather than for the personal relationship the encounter's intimate character might have suggested. The Baron's participation was coerced through the Bene Gesserit's institutional leverage, through the mechanisms the sisterhood's political influence deployed for the encounter's procurement. The encounter was not voluntary, was not the consensual interaction the personal relationship's character would have required. The encounter was the institutional operation, was conducted through the leverage the sisterhood's institutional position provided for the encounter's purposes. The disease was the encounter's consequence. Mohiam gave the Baron the disease, transmitted the condition whose progressive effects would produce the obesity the Baron's later years were defined by. The transmission was deliberate, was the Bene Gesserit's deployment of the biological weapon against the person the weapon was designed to affect. The deliberateness was the sisterhood's institutional judgment. Mohiam's decision to transmit the disease was the decision the sisterhood's assessment of the Baron's treatment of the encounter had informed, the judgment that the Baron's behavior during the encounter warranted the biological consequence the disease would produce. The consequence was the humiliation, the disease's progressive effects, the obesity, the physical dependency on the suspensors, the body's deterioration, were the consequences the Bene Gesserit's deployment of the biological weapon produced across the years of the disease's progression. The humiliation was sustained, was maintained across the decades of the Baron's governance through the disease's ongoing effects on the body the governance was conducted from. The sustained humiliation was the relationship's most consequential product, the consequence the encounter produced in the person the encounter encompassed alongside the genetic contribution the breeding program required. The encounter produced the genetics. The encounter also produced the disease. The genetics were the institutional purposes product. The disease was the institutional judgment's product. The dual production was the encounter's irony, the production of the genetic contribution, the breeding program valued alongside the biological weapon the institutional judgment deployed. The contribution and the weapon were both the encounter's products. The contribution served the sisterhood's purposes. The weapon served the sisterhood's judgment. The purposes and the judgment were both the sisterhood's institutional operations expressions. The Corrino Harkonnen political dance was the dance the dynasty and the house conducted across the centuries of the governance's operation. The sustained political interaction the feudal framework's institutional dynamics generated. The dance was the management. The Corrino dynasty managed the Harkonnen house, maintained the house's position within the political landscape's managed dynamics, calibrated the house's competitive activities to the levels the balance's calibration required, managed the house's institutional operations within the parameters the governance's stability demanded. The management was conducted through the mechanisms the feudal framework provided. The fief assignments, the governance responsibilities the dynasty distributed among the Landsraad's houses were the primary mechanism the management employed. The Arrakis assignment was the management's most consequential deployment. The placement of the house in the governance position, the spice production's economic significance, made the Imperium's most valuable fief. The assignment's provision was the management's reward, the dynasty's compensation for the house's compliance with the dynasty's governance. The assignment's withdrawal was the management's punishment, the dynasty's sanction for the house's non-compliance with the dynasty's requirements. The Baron's relationship with Shaddam was the relationship the dance's most consequential phase produced. The Baron and the Emperor shared the interests the conspiracy aligned, shared the desire for the Atreides' elimination that the conspiracy was designed to accomplish. The shared desire was the dance's convergence, the moment at which the dynasty's interests and the house's interests aligned in the direction the conspiracy pursued. The convergence was temporary. The shared interest in the Atreides' elimination was the interest that aligned the Baron and the Emperor for the conspiracy's duration. The interest's satisfaction, the Atreides' destruction, would have been the convergence's end. The post-destruction dynamics would have returned the dynasty and the house to the competitive relationship the pre-convergence dynamics had encompassed. The convergence's termination came sooner than the dynasty anticipated. The revolution, the consequence the conspiracy's incompleteness had produced, terminated the convergence by destroying both the Baron and the Emperor's political position. The dance ended. The dancers were eliminated. The revolution's military and political events removed both the dynasty and the house from the political landscape's active dimension. The house's economic operations mechanics were the mechanics that connected the governance philosophy to the commercial activities the philosophy generated, the detailed operations the economic dimension encompassed. The spice harvesting's revenue was the operation's most consequential economic input. The revenue generated by the Arrakis governance's spice production, the income the CHOAM framework's commercial distribution generated from the melange the harvesting operations collected, was the revenue whose magnitude made the revenue the house's economic position's most important component. The revenue was managed through the Baron's personal oversight. The economic operations that generated the spice revenue, the harvesting's logistics, the production's volumes, the commercial distribution's management, were overseen through the governance's administrative apparatus under the Baron's direction. The direction was personal, reflected the Baron's assessment of the operation's optimal management rather than the institutional assessment the bureaucratic management would have produced. The personal direction produced the extraction's optimization. The Baron's management optimized the extraction, maximized the production's output, minimized the production's costs, calibrated the operation's efficiency to the levels the revenue's maximization required. The optimization was the governance philosophy's economic expression. The instrumentalism deployed in the economic dimension for the extraction's productivity, the instrumentalism specified. The optimization's costs were the costs the optimization's focus excluded from the optimization's calculation. The environmental costs, the ecological consequences the extraction's operations generated in the desert's conditions were excluded. The human costs, the personnel casualties the operation's hazards produced, the labor conditions the operation's demands imposed, were included only as the production's operational expenses rather than as the governance's moral obligations. The exclusion was the governance philosophy's economic limitation. The philosophy that treated the world as the raw material the governance processed excluded the world's dimensions that the raw material's categorization did not encompass. The environmental was excluded because the environmental was not the production's input. The moral was excluded because the moral was not the production's cost. The exclusions were the philosophy's blind spots, the dimensions the philosophy's categories did not address. The blind spots accumulated their consequences. The environmental consequences accumulated in the ecology the extraction operated within. The moral consequences accumulated in the populations the extraction affected. The accumulations were the blind spots products, were generated by the consequences the philosophy's exclusions prevented the governance from perceiving. The accumulations contributed to the revolution. The ecological consequences contributed to the conditions the revolution exploited. The moral consequences contributed to the resentments the revolution mobilized. The contributions were the blind spots political products, were the political consequences the economic exclusions accumulated effects generated. The complete 10,000-year history of House Harkonnen was the history of the accumulations, the sustained, generational, philosophically grounded accumulation of the consequences the governance philosophy's operations generated and the governance philosophy's blind spots prevented the governance from perceiving. The accumulations culminated. The culmination was the revolution. The revolution consumed the house. The consumption was the accumulation's expression, the moment at which the accumulated consequences exceeded the institutional resilience the house's operations maintained. The house ended. The genetics continued. The pattern completed. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen died at the hands of a child whose existence the Baron's own operations had produced. The consequence returned to the source. The pattern held. The Harkonnen assault on the Atreides household was the military operation that demonstrated the governance philosophy's tactical capabilities in the operation's most consequential deployment, the execution of the conspiracy's operational plan through the military methods the house's tradition maintained. The assault was planned. The Baron's strategic design, developed across the months of the conspiracy's preparation, refined through the intelligence the apparatus provided, calibrated through the coordination the Emperor's collaboration required, was the plan whose execution the assault's military operations implemented. The plan's tactical dimensions included the Tsar Dokar's deployment. The Imperial soldiers, disguised in Harkonnen uniforms to maintain the conspiracy's deniability, with a military component whose capability exceeded the conventional force's parameters. The Tsar Dokar's deployment was the Emperor's contribution, the military asset the Emperor provided for the operation the shared interests required. The plan's internal dimension included Yua's betrayal. The Doctor, whose conditioning had been circumvented through the emotional leverage the captured wife provided, whose loyalty had been compromised through the governance philosophy's identification and exploitation of the personal vulnerability, was the dimension that provided the access the external assault could not have achieved alone. The assault was executed at night. The timing, the nocturnal deployment that exploited the darkness the desert's diurnal cycle provided, was the tactical choice the operation's surprise required. The night masked the assault's scale, concealed the military force's deployment from the observation the daylight would have provided, maintained the surprise the operation's initial success depended on. The assault's execution was efficient. The military operations that the tactical plan specified, the perimeter breach, the defence's neutralization, the household's containment, were executed with the competence the combined Harkonnen-Tsar Dokar forces capability produced. The execution was professional, was conducted with the military discipline the force's training had developed, was managed with the operational precision the plan's complexity required. The Duke was captured. The household's defense was overwhelmed. The military force's survivors were eliminated or captured. The destruction's military dimension was comprehensive, encompassed the household's military capability in the totality the operation's design specified. Jessica and Paul escaped. The escape, facilitated by the circumstances the assault's execution did not manage to prevent, was the gap the comprehensiveness did not close. The gap was the operation's most consequential element, the opening through which the consequences the operation was designed to prevent entered the political landscape. The escape's facilitation included Yueh's conflicted contribution. The Doctor, whose betrayal had enabled the assault, also facilitated the escape, provided the circumstances the escape required, alongside the access the assault demanded. The facilitation was the conflict's expression, the manifestation of the competing loyalties the leverage's exploitation had produced in the person the exploitation encompassed. The dual contribution, the betrayal and the facilitation, was the governance philosophy's limitation demonstrated in the personal dimension. The exploitation that produced the betrayal also produced the resistance the facilitation expressed. The exploitation could not produce the pure betrayal the operation required, could not generate the total compliance the pure instrumentalism demanded, because the person the instrumentalism was applied to was a person rather than an instrument. The person retained the dimensions the instrumentalism's treatment did not encompass, retained the loyalties the leverage did not fully override, retained the commitments the exploitation did not completely suppress. The retention was the personhood's resistance to the instrumentalism. The person treated as the instrument resisted the treatment, maintained the dimensions the treatment did not encompass, preserved the qualities the instrumentalism's categories did not address. The resistance was the personhood's quality, the characteristic the person possessed and the instrument did not, the dimension the human being encompassed and the tool did not. Raban's governance of Arrakis was the governance the Baron deployed as the two-phase plan's first phase, the oppressive administration the plan's political logic required for the second phase's relief narrative's establishment. Raban governed with brutality, the governance's character shaped by Raban's personal qualities and by the Baron's instructions. Was the character the oppressive administration's purpose demanded. The brutality was comprehensive, encompassed the economic dimension, the military dimension, the social dimension, and the administrative dimension. The increased spice production quotas were the economic oppression's expression. The Baron demanded the revenues the increased production would generate, demanded the economic output the oppressive governance's maximization would produce. Raban's governance pursued the demanded output through the production's intensification, through the increased harvesting operations, the extended collection schedules, the expanded deployment the production's volumes increase required. The intensification consumed. The increased production consumed the resources the increased operations required, consumed the equipment the expanded deployment utilized, consumed the personnel the extended schedules employed, consumed the conditions the intensified operations affected. The consumption was the oppression's economic cost, the price the increased production extracted from the resources the production encompassed. The Fremen suppression was the military oppression's expression. Raban's governance pursued the Fremen through the military operations the suppression required, deployed the forces, conducted the raids, maintained the military pressure the suppression's continued operation demanded. The suppression was counterproductive. The military operations that pursued the Fremen, the raids, the patrols, the aggressive engagements the suppression encompassed, were the operations that strengthened the Fremen through the hardening the military pressure produced. The suppression's military activities provided the combat experience the Fremen's military capability was refined through. The raids provided the tactical encounters the Fremen's combat skills were developed through. The pressure provided the sustained adversarial condition the Fremen's military resilience was forged through. The counterproductivity was the governance philosophy's military limitation. The philosophy that treated the population as the resource the governance managed did not assess the population as the force the suppression's operations were developing. The suppression was designed to reduce the population's resistance. the suppression increased the population's capability. The design and the outcome were opposite, were the different products of the operation the philosophy's assessment had specified and the reality the assessment had not encompassed. Raban did not perceive the counterproductivity. The governance philosophy's assessment framework, the instrumentalism's categorical treatment of the population as the resource, did not include the assessment categories the counterproductivity's perception required. The framework assessed the suppression's intensity. The framework did not assess the suppression's effects on the suppressed population's capabilities. The non-assessment was the framework's gap, the blind spot the philosophy's categories produced in the governance's analytical apparatus. The population's experience under Harkonnen rule was the experience the governance philosophy produced in the persons the governance encompassed. The lived conditions the instrumentalist administration generated in the populations the administration managed. The experience was harsh. The governance that treated the population as the labor force the production consumed, that managed the persons as the resources the economy processed, produced the experience the instrumental treatment generated. The experience included the working conditions, the labor the production's operations imposed, the schedules the production's demands required, the physical conditions the production's environment maintained. The experience included the living conditions, the habitation the governance provided, the housing, the nutrition, the sanitation the governance's administrative management encompassed. Was the habitation the governance's instrumental assessment determined was sufficient for the labor force's maintenance? The assessment was calibrated to the labor's productivity rather than to the person's well-being. Was the determination of what the labor required for the continued operation rather than what the persons required for the comfortable existence? The calibration was the governance philosophy's social expression, the philosophy that assessed the population's value through the production's requirements, assessed the living conditions through the production's needs, assessed the habitation's adequacy through the question of whether the habitation maintained the labor force rather than through the question of whether the habitation served the persons. The experience included the political conditions. The governance denied the population the political participation the governance's authority could have provided, denied the persons the engagement in the governance's decisions the person's citizenship should have encompassed. The denial was the instrumentalism's political expression, the consequence of the governance's treatment of the population as the labor force rather than as the citizenry. The experience was formative. The populations whose lived conditions the Harkonnen governance produced were the populations whose institutional expectations the conditions shaped, whose understanding of the governance the conditions experience informed, whose assessment of the political possibilities the conditions experience limited. The formation was the governance's most consequential social product. The populations formed by the Harkonnen governance were the populations whose expectations were calibrated to the governance's conditions, whose understanding of the governance's possibilities reflected the conditions the governance had provided. The calibration was the governance's institutional achievement and the governance's institutional limitation. The achievement of the compliance the calibration produced and the limitation of the aspiration the calibration constrained. The House's propaganda and self-image were the propaganda the governance maintained for the House's political presentation, and the self-image the governance sustained for the House's institutional identity. The propaganda presented the House as the effective. The political presentation the House maintained for the Landsraad's observation, the image the House projected for the political landscape's assessment, was the presentation of the governance's effectiveness. The presentation emphasized the production, highlighted the economic output the governance generated, demonstrated the commercial productivity the governance's management sustained, displayed the institutional results the governance's operations produced. The presentation excluded the costs. The propaganda that displayed the production did not display the consumption, did not present the environmental degradation, the population's conditions, the moral costs the production's operations generated. The exclusion was the presentation's management, the calibration of the displayed and the concealed the presentation's political purposes required. The concealment was the governance philosophy's presentational expression. The philosophy that focused on the production's output excluded the production's costs from the philosophy's assessment, excluded the dimensions the philosophy's categories did not encompass. The propaganda reflected the philosophy, presented the dimensions the philosophy included, while concealing the dimensions the philosophy excluded. The self-image sustained the conviction. The House's institutional identity, the understanding the House maintained of the House's character, was the identity the conviction sustained. The conviction said, the Harkonnen governance is effective. The governance's effectiveness is the governance's justification. The justification validates the methods the governance employs. The self-image did not include the assessment of the method's moral character. The conviction that assessed the governance through the effectiveness did not assess the governance through the morality, did not evaluate the method's moral quality alongside the method's operational quality. The non-assessment was the self-image's limitation, the gap the conviction's effectiveness focused assessment produced in the House's understanding of the House's character. The gap was the governance philosophy's most consequential self-awareness's absence. The House that did not assess the method's moral character was the House that could not perceive the method's moral consequences, could not see the resentments the exploitation generated, could not perceive the resistance the oppression produced, could not assess the dynamics the instrumentalism's sustained operation was generating in the institutional environment the House operated within. The non-perception was the blindness the governance philosophy sustained. The philosophy that focused on the production excluded the production's consequences from the perception's scope. The exclusion produced the blindness. The blindness produced the vulnerability. The vulnerability was exploited by the revolution the blindness had concealed. The self-image was the governance philosophy's final product in the institutional dimension. The House that believed in the governance's effectiveness believed in the governance until the governance's consequences consumed the governance. The belief persisted until the consequences' arrival. The arrival destroyed the belief alongside the believers. The destruction was the self-image's termination, the end of the conviction the governance philosophy had sustained across the centuries of the conviction's institutional maintenance. The conviction ended when the consequences arrived. The consequences arrived when the revolution deployed the force the governance's blindness had concealed. The revolution was the consequences' expression. The destruction was the consequences' product. The Baron died believing in the governance. The Baron died believing in the methods. The Baron died believing in the effectiveness. The beliefs did not save the Baron. The beliefs did not perceive the consequences. The consequences consumed the believer. The complete 10,000-year history of House Harkonnen was the history of the believing, the sustained, institutional, philosophically grounded conviction that the exploitation was the effective method, and that the effectiveness was the method's justification. The conviction was maintained for 10,000 years. The conviction was destroyed in a single afternoon. The afternoon was the battle for Arrakis. The child's Gomjabar was the conviction's termination. The most powerful head of one of the Imperium's wealthiest houses was killed by a girl who was barely more than 2 years old. The governance philosophy met its consequences. The consequences: 1. The Harkonnen military tradition was the tradition the governance philosophy produced in the martial dimension. The approach to warfare the instrumentalist governance generated in the military operations the House maintained. The tradition was professional. The Harkonnen military's training, equipment, and organizational structure were maintained at the standards the Imperium's military landscape demanded. The professionalism was the tradition's functional quality, the quality that made the military operations the governance deployed operationally effective in the engagements the operations were designed to conduct. The tradition was also instrumental. The military was treated as the governance's tool, was deployed for the purposes the governance specified, was managed through the institutional mechanisms the governance's authority maintained, was directed through the command the governance philosophy's hierarchical structure provided. The instrumentalism was the tradition's institutional quality, the quality that made the military the governance's instrument rather than the governance's partner. The instrumental treatment shaped the military's culture. The soldiers who served the Harkonnen military served within the culture the instrumental treatment produced. The culture in which the soldier's value was assessed through the soldier's utility. The culture in which the person's significance was determined by the person's operational contribution. The culture in which the individual's worth was calibrated to the individual's productivity. The calibration was the culture's defining quality. The Harkonnen soldiers knew their value was their utility. The knowledge shaped the soldier's behavior, produced the compliance the knowledge generated, maintained the obedience the calibration imposed, sustained the operational discipline the utility-based assessment demanded. The calibration also produced the limitation. The soldiers whose value was their utility were the soldiers whose commitment was their utility's duration. The soldiers who served while the service was the utility's expression and whose commitment did not extend beyond the utility's requirements. The commitment was conditional, was sustained by the conditions the utility's assessment created, rather than by the loyalty the reciprocal relationship would have generated. The conditional commitment was the tradition's vulnerability. The commitment that depended on the conditions, that was maintained by the utility's assessment rather than by the loyalty's attachment, was the commitment that failed when the conditions changed. The conditions that sustained the commitment were the conditions the governance maintained. The governance's disruption disrupted the conditions. The conditions' disruption disrupted the commitment. The disruption was demonstrated at Arrakis. The Harkonnen soldiers, whose conditional commitment the governance's institutional structure sustained, whose compliance the utility-based assessment maintained, were the soldiers whose commitment failed when the revolution's military force overwhelmed the structure the commitment depended on. The soldiers did not fight with the loyalty's endurance. The soldiers fought with the compliance's duration. The duration was shorter. The duration was insufficient. The insufficiency was the tradition's military limitation. The consequence the instrumental treatment produced in the combat the treatment's conditions could not sustain. The soldiers were competent. The soldiers were not committed. The competence without the commitment was the competence without the endurance. The endurance was the quality the critical engagement required. The quality's absence was the engagement's outcome. The House's relationship with Chom was the relationship the economic dimension of the governance produced in the commercial framework the Imperium's economy was organized around. The Harkonnen Chom shareholding was the shareholding the House's economic position generated, the commercial ownership the House's institutional wealth's magnitude provided. The shareholding was consequential, was the portion of the CHOAM framework's ownership structure the House's economic position entitled the House to, was the commercial stake whose magnitude reflected the House's economic significance. The shareholding provided the influence. The commercial ownership that the shareholding constituted, the stake in the CHOAM framework's institutional governance, the ownership provided, was the influence the House deployed in the framework's management decisions. The influence shaped the framework's operations, affected the pricing, the distribution, the commercial policies the framework's management produced. The spice revenue amplified the influence. The Arrakis governance's commercial contribution to the CHOAM framework, the spice production's economic output distributed through the framework's commercial channels, was the contribution whose magnitude exceeded the other contributions' magnitudes. The amplification was the contribution's product, was the influence, the commercial significance, the contribution's magnitude generated in the framework's institutional dynamics. The amplification was temporary. The Arrakis fief's transfer, the loss of the spice governance to the Atreides the Emperor's conspiracy had arranged, reduced the amplification the spice contribution had provided. The reduction was temporary. The conspiracy's operation was designed to recover the fief's governance through the Atreides' destruction the operation's military elements would accomplish. The recovery was achieved. The Atreides' destruction restored the Harkonnen governance to Arrakis, restored the spice production's management to the House's control, recovered the commercial contributions amplification the fief's governance provided. The recovery was also temporary. The revolution that the destruction's incompleteness had produced, the Fremen uprising that Paul's emergence from the desert had mobilized, destroyed the recovered governance alongside the House that conducted it. The commercial contribution was lost. The amplification was eliminated. The CHOAM relationship was terminated. The termination was the economic dimension's expression of the House's political destruction. The House's elimination from the political landscape was the House's elimination from the economic landscape. The removal of the commercial participant from the framework the participant had operated within. The Baron's personality, examined beyond the governance philosophy's institutional expression, was the personality the governance tradition and the personal experience had combined to produce. The Baron was vain. The personal quality, the sustained attention to the self-presentation, the vanity maintained, was the quality the younger years' physical form had supported and the disease's progression had assaulted. The vanity persisted despite the assault, was maintained through the suspensor's technology, through the clothing's management, through the presentation's sustained attention despite the body's deterioration. The persistence was the vanity's character. The quality of the self regards maintenance against the conditions the disease's progression imposed. The vanity was not reduced by the obesity. The vanity was maintained alongside the obesity, was sustained through the methods the technology provided, was expressed through the dimensions the body's condition permitted. The Baron was also cruel. The personal quality, the capacity for the infliction of the suffering the cruelty encompassed, was the quality the institutional culture's competitive hostility had cultivated alongside the governance philosophy's instrumentalism. The cruelty was not the sadism the clinical definition described. The cruelty was the indifference. The capacity for the suffering's infliction through the non-perception of the suffering's significance that the instrumentalism's categorization produced. The non-perception was the cruelty's mechanism. The Baron did not perceive the person's suffering as the suffering the moral assessment should have registered. The Baron perceived the person's suffering as the consequence the governance's operations produced, as the output the governance's activities generated alongside the other outputs the activities encompassed. The suffering was categorized as the production's byproduct rather than as the governance's moral cost. The categorization was the governance philosophy's personal expression. The philosophy that treated the world as the raw material treated the suffering as the processing's consequence. The treatment was the cruelty, was the personal capacity for the suffering's infliction through the philosophy's non-registration of the suffering's moral significance. The Baron was intelligent. The personal quality, the political intelligence the governance tradition had developed, was the quality the governance philosophy's most consequential person expressed with the sophistication the intelligence's development had produced. The intelligence was strategic, encompassed the multi-layered planning, the sustained assessment, the complex manipulation the governance's competitive operations required. The intelligence was also limited. The intelligence that could design the multi-layered schemes could not perceive the scheme's consequences return, could not see the dynamics the governance philosophy's operations were generating, could not assess the forces the instrumentalism's sustained deployment was producing. The limitation was the governance philosophy's intellectual constraint, the constraint the philosophy's categorical framework imposed on the intelligence the philosophy's institutional culture had developed. The constraint was the intelligence's most consequential quality. The intelligence that was capable of the sophisticated design was the intelligence that was incapable of the consequences assessment. The capability and the incapability coexisted in the same mind, were both the governance philosophy's products, were both generated by the institutional culture the philosophy sustained. The Harkonnen legacy in the Atreides twins was the legacy the genetics carried into the saga's continuation, the biological contribution the breeding program's management had placed in the persons whose consciousness would carry the saga's narrative beyond the house's political destruction. Leto and Ganima carried the Harkonnen genetics. The great-grandchildren, the persons whose biological lineage included the Baron's genetic contribution through Jessica's placement and Paul's inheritance, were the persons in whom the Harkonnen biological legacy persisted beyond the house's political elimination. The Baron's presence in the twins' other memory was the presence the preborn consciousness's ancestral access encompassed. The twins could access the Baron, could perceive the ancestral personality the genetic memory preserved, could engage with the presence the other memories' populated landscape included. Leto managed the presence. The child who would become the God Emperor, whose consciousness's development would produce the capability the management required, managed the Baron's ancestral personality alongside the other presences the other memory encompassed. The management was the consciousness's operation, was the sustained, comprehensive attention to the presence's population the consciousness's architecture maintained. The management demonstrated the Baron's containment across the 3,500-year governance. The ancestral personality that had overwhelmed Alia, that had seized the consciousness the preborn condition's vulnerability made susceptible, was the personality Leto contained for millennia. The containment was the management's achievement, the demonstration that the consciousness whose development exceeded the abomination's vulnerability could maintain the control the ancestral personality's assertive tendencies required. The Baron's contained presence across the God Emperor's governance was the governance philosophy's final condition. The philosophy whose practitioner had governed the house's competitive operations for decades was the philosophy whose practitioner's preserved personality was contained within the consciousness that governed the civilization for millennia. The competitive was encompassed by the comprehensive. The decade's duration was encompassed by the millennia's duration. The instrumental was managed by the comprehensive. The containment was the final irony. The man who had managed persons was now managed. The person who had treated others as instruments was now the instrument, was the contained presence within the conscious that managed the contained alongside the other presences the management encompassed. The manager was managed, the instrumentalist was instrumented, the schemer was contained. The containment endured for 3,500 years. The Baron, preserved in the biological memory, maintained in the consciousness's managed landscape. Contained within the God Emperor's comprehensive awareness, endured the containment across the millennia the governance encompassed. The endurance was the final demonstration. The governance philosophy that had operated for decades in the competitive dimension was the philosophy whose practitioner endured the containment for millennia in the managed dimension. The decades operator endured the millennia's containment. The shorter was encompassed by the longer. The competitive was encompassed by the comprehensive. The instrumental was managed by the aware. The complete 10,000-year history of House Harkonnen was the history that the pattern concluded, the pattern of the exploitation's consequences returning to the exploiters. The instruments turning on the hands that wielded them, the governance philosophy's products consuming the governance philosophy's practitioners. The history began with the feud. The animosity that connected the house to the Atreides across the millennia was the rivalry that defined the house's institutional identity. Through the contrast, the rivalry sustained. The feud was the identity. The identity was the feud. The history encompassed the governance. The institutional philosophy that treated the world as the raw material the governance processed, that managed the populations as the labor force the production consumed, that deployed the persons as the instruments the governance's purposes required, was the philosophy whose sustained operation produced the consequences the philosophy's practitioners could not survive. The history included the schemes, the Baron's multi-layered strategies, the sophisticated designs whose execution produced the Atreides' destruction and whose incompleteness produced the Atreides' revolution, were the schemes whose consequences returned to the schemers through the mechanisms the scheme's operations had generated. The history concluded with the destruction. The House's political elimination, the revolution's military and political events, comprehensive removal of the House's leadership, was the conclusion the consequences accumulation had produced. The destruction was the pattern's completion, the moment at which the accumulated consequences exceeded the institutional resilience the House's operations maintained. The conclusion was not the ending. The genetics persisted. The biological legacy, the genetic contribution the breeding program's management had placed in the Atreides bloodline, survived the political destruction the revolution produced. The genetics continued in the twins. The genetics continued in the God Emperor. The genetics continued in the biological lineage the saga's subsequent events documented. The persistence and the destruction coexisted. The political ended, the biological continued. The institutional failed, the genetic persisted. The coexistence was the history's final assessment, the assessment that the biological exceeded the institutional in durability, that the genetics outlasted the governance, that the contribution persisted beyond the contributor. The complete 10,000-year history of House Harkonnen, the house that ruled through exploitation, the house that fell through consequences, the house whose genetics persisted in the bloodline the exploitation had been directed against. The pattern held across every dimension. The exploitation produced, the consequences returned, the consequences consumed, the gom jabbar in the child's hand, the poison in the Baron's flesh, the consequence in the source's body, the complete history, the complete pattern, the complete demonstration. House Harkonnen. 10,000 years. One pattern. One conclusion. The consequences always return.